The windswept landscapes of northern Denmark and the Jutland Peninsula witnessed the emergence of one of early medieval Europe's most influential yet enigmatic Germanic peoples. Between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, archaeological evidence reveals the gradual consolidation of tribal groups that would eventually become known as the Jutes, their distinctive material culture and settlement patterns marking them as a people apart from their Germanic neighbours. These proto-Jutish communities established themselves across the northern reaches of what modern scholars term the Cimbrian Peninsula, creating a cultural foundation that would endure for centuries and ultimately influence the transformation of post-Roman Britain. The earliest archaeological traces of Jutish settlement concentrate heavily in northern Jutland, particularly around the Limfjord region and extending southward through the central peninsula. Excavations at sites like Segelflod, Norresned, and Himmerland have revealed substantial evidence of organised communities dating to the early Roman Iron Age. These settlements demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of landscape utilisation, with communities strategically positioned to exploit both agricultural opportunities and access to waterways essential for trade and communication. The characteristic longhouse structures uncovered at these sites measure between 15 and 25 metres in length, constructed with timber frames and wattle and daub walls, their design reflecting both practical considerations for the harsh northern climate and social organisation patterns that distinguished Jutish communities from contemporary Germanic groups. Settlement archaeology reveals that proto-Jutish communities organised themselves around extended family units occupying these substantial dwellings. Each longhouse typically sheltered multiple generations, with internal divisions separating human habitation from livestock areas during winter months. Post-hole patterns indicate sophisticated construction techniques, with supporting timbers arranged to maximise internal space while maintaining structural integrity against coastal storms and harsh winter conditions. The positioning of hearths, storage areas, and sleeping quarters within these structures suggests a hierarchical social organisation, with the most prominent families occupying the largest and most centrally located buildings within each settlement cluster. The material culture emerging from 1st through 3 RD century Jutish sites presents distinctive characteristics that separate these communities from neighbouring Anglian and Saxon territories. Pottery assemblages from Jutish settlements display unique decorative motifs and vessel forms that persist across multiple generations. The characteristic Jutish ceramics feature angular geometric patterns, often incorporating horizontal banding and hatched triangular designs that appear consistently across northern Jutland sites, but remain absent from contemporary Saxon archaeological contexts in Holstein or Anglian territories further south. These vessels, ranging from large storage jars to smaller drinking cups, demonstrate both functional sophistication and aesthetic preferences that mark Jutish cultural identity. Metalworking evidence from early Jutish sites reveals advanced technological capabilities and distinctive stylistic preferences. Iron production facilities uncovered at several locations indicate local smelting operations utilising bog iron deposits abundant throughout the peninsula. The quality of iron implements recovered from Jutish graves and settlement contexts demonstrates sophisticated understanding of metallurgical processes. Bronzeworking also flourished, with distinctive fibulae, belt fittings and decorative items displaying characteristic Jutish artistic motifs. These bronze artefacts often incorporate spiral designs and interlaced patterns that would later influence Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions in Britain. Grave goods from Jutish burial sites provide crucial insights into social stratification and cultural values during this formative period. High-status burials, particularly those discovered in the Himmerland region, contain elaborate assemblages including imported glass vessels, amber jewellery and finely crafted weapons. The presence of Roman-manufactured items in these graves indicates extensive trade networks and the accumulation of wealth by Jutish elites. However, The specific combination of grave goods differs markedly from contemporary Saxon or Anglian burial practices. Jutish graves frequently contain distinctive brooches with square heads and elaborate animal ornamentation, while weapon sets often include specific spear types and shield boss designs that appear rarely in neighbouring Germanic territories. The organisation of Jutish cemeteries reveals important aspects of social structure and religious practices. Unlike the scattered individual burials common among some Germanic groups, Jutish communities established organised cemetery areas that served multiple generations. These burial grounds demonstrate careful spatial organisation, with family groups maintaining distinct areas within larger cemetery complexes. The orientation of graves, typically east-west alignment, and the consistent inclusion of personal possessions suggest developed beliefs about afterlife and social continuity beyond death. Tribal organisation among the proto-Jutish peoples appears to have centred around kinship-based groups led by warrior aristocrats, whose status derived from military prowess, control of agricultural resources, and management of trade relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests these leaders maintained substantial halls that served as centres for community gatherings, feast distribution, and decision-making processes. The size and elaboration of these halls, evidenced by post-hole patterns and artefact distributions, indicate significant social stratification within Jutish communities. The relationship between Jutish tribes and neighbouring Germanic peoples reveals a complex pattern of interaction, competition, and cultural exchange. To the south, Saxon communities in Holstein maintained distinct material culture traditions, while sharing certain technological innovations with their Jutish neighbours. Trade in iron implements, amber, and agricultural products created economic interdependence despite periodic territorial conflicts. Archaeological evidence from border regions shows mixed assemblages suggesting intermarriage and cultural blending, yet core Jutish identity markers persist in northern territories. Anglian communities, concentrated in the southern portions of the Cimbrian Peninsula and extending into modern Schleswig-Holstein, developed parallel but distinct cultural traditions, while sharing basic Germanic linguistic and religious foundations with the Jutes. Anglian material culture displays different pottery traditions, burial practices, and settlement organisation patterns. The boundary between Jutish and Anglian territories appears to have remained relatively stable during the early centuries AD, with the Kungea River serving as an approximate cultural divide. Roman trade relationships profoundly influenced Jutish society during the 1st through 3rd centuries, introducing new technologies, luxury goods, and organisational concepts that transformed traditional Germanic social structures. Roman merchants operating through intermediaries and frontier trading posts sought northern European products including amber, furs, and iron implements. The amber trade proved particularly significant for Jutish communities, as the peninsula's coastal regions provided access to some of Europe's finest amber deposits. Jutish craftsmen developed sophisticated techniques for working amber into jewellery and decorative objects, many of which found their way to Roman markets through established trade networks. The influx of Roman silver coins into Jutish territories during this period indicates substantial economic activity and the accumulation of wealth by tribal elites. Coin hoards discovered throughout northern Jutland contain predominantly Roman silver denarii and aurae, often buried during periods of political instability or military threat. The distribution patterns of these hoards suggest that Roman currency circulated widely within Jutish society, though primarily among the upper social strata, who controlled trade relationships and military resources. Roman technological influences appear throughout Jutish material culture during this period. Improved agricultural implements, including more efficient plough designs and harvesting tools, increased agricultural productivity and supported larger population concentrations. Roman-inspired construction techniques influenced the design of elite residences, with some high-status sites displaying masonry foundations and tile roofing elements previously unknown in Germanic architectural traditions. The adoption of Roman measurement standards and construction principles enhanced the sophistication of Jutish building projects while maintaining distinctly Germanic aesthetic preferences. The impact of Roman military organisation and tactical concepts transformed Jutish warfare practices during the early centuries AD. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and warrior graves indicates the adoption of Roman-influenced armour designs, improved sword construction techniques, and standardised spear and shield configurations. These military innovations enhanced Jutish fighting capabilities and contributed to their reputation as formidable warriors among neighbouring Germanic tribes. Roman diplomatic contacts with Jutish leaders introduced concepts of written agreements, formal alliance structures, and systematic tribute arrangements that influenced tribal political organisation. While maintaining traditional Germanic leadership structures based on personal loyalty and warrior bonds, Jutish chieftains began adopting Roman administrative practices for managing larger territories and more complex economic relationships. The influence of Roman legal concepts appears in archaeological evidence suggesting more formalised property ownership patterns and inheritance practices among Jutish elites. The gradual transformation of Jutish society during these crucial centuries established the cultural, technological, and organisational foundations that would enable their later participation in the migration period movements that reshaped post-Roman Europe. The distinctive material culture, sophisticated social organisation, and extensive trade networks developed during the 1st through 3rd centuries AD positioned the Jutes as significant players in the complex political and military developments that would define the early medieval period. The established Jutish communities of northern Denmark found themselves increasingly pressured by demographic changes and political upheavals that swept across northern Europe during the 4th and early 5th centuries AD. Population growth within the confined territories of the Cimbrian Peninsula, combined with climatic deterioration that reduced agricultural yields, created conditions that made large-scale migration both necessary and attractive. The Roman Empire's weakening grip on its northern frontiers opened unprecedented opportunities for Germanic peoples to establish new territories in previously inaccessible regions, with Britain emerging as the most promising destination for organised tribal movements. The traditional date of 449 AD for the beginning of large-scale Germanic settlement in Britain, while likely simplified in later chroniclers' accounts, represents a watershed moment when Jutish warriors first established permanent footholds in southeastern England. Unlike the chaotic raids that characterised earlier Germanic interactions with Roman Britain, the 5th century movements involved entire communities including craftsmen, farmers, and families seeking permanent settlement. Archaeological evidence from both Danish and British sites demonstrates clear continuity in material culture, settlement patterns, and burial practices that confirm substantial population transfers rather than mere military expeditions. Jutish participation in these migrations differed significantly from the simultaneous movements of Angles and Saxons, both in terms of geographic focus and organisational structure. While Saxon groups concentrated their efforts on the Thames Valley and southern England, and Anglian communities targeted the eastern and northern regions, Jutish settlers established their primary strongholds in Kent, the Isle of Wight, and portions of Hampshire. This geographic distribution reflects both strategic considerations and existing political relationships that Jutish leaders had cultivated with Romano-British authorities seeking Germanic military assistance against Pictish and Scottish raiders. The Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed around 731 AD, provides the most detailed contemporary account of Jutish settlement patterns, though his perspective reflects 8th century political realities rather than 5th century conditions. Bede specifically identifies the Jutes as the primary settlers of Kent and the Isle of Wight, distinguishing them clearly from the Angles and Saxons who established kingdoms elsewhere in England. His account describes how Jutish leaders negotiated formal agreements with British authorities, receiving grants of land in exchange for military service against external threats. These arrangements, while initially temporary, evolved into permanent territorial control as British political authority collapsed throughout much of southeastern England. Archaeological excavations in Kent have revealed extensive evidence supporting Bede's account of concentrated Jutish settlement. The distinctive pottery styles, metalwork designs and burial practices found at sites like Fingalsham, Sarre and Eastry display clear continuity with northern Danish material culture from the 4th and early 5th centuries. Cruciform brooches recovered from Kentish graves match examples from Jutland so closely that they were likely manufactured by the same craftsmen or their immediate descendants. The consistency of these material culture markers across multiple sites indicates organised community settlement rather than gradual cultural diffusion. The cemetery at Fingalsham provides particularly compelling evidence for direct Jutish migration. Grave goods from the earliest phases of burial activity include distinctive square-headed brooches, amber beads, and weapon sets that mirror exactly the assemblages found in contemporary northern Danish graves. The spatial organisation of the cemetery, with family groups maintaining distinct burial areas, replicates the organisational patterns observed in Jutish homeland cemeteries. Most significantly, isotope analysis of skeletal remains from early graves indicates that many individuals spent their childhood years in Scandinavia before migrating to Kent, providing direct biological evidence for the population movement. The legendary figures of Hengist and Horsa occupy central positions in later Anglo-Saxon historical traditions, though their specific ethnic identities remain subjects of scholarly debate. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled centuries after the events it describes, presents these brothers as leaders of the initial Germanic settlement in Kent around 449 AD. According to these accounts, Hengist and Horsa arrived with 3 ships at the invitation of the British king Vortigern, who sought Germanic military assistance against Pictish invasions. The Chronicle describes how these leaders established the first Germanic kingdom in southeastern Britain, with Hengist founding the royal dynasty that would rule Kent for the next 3 centuries. However, the historical reliability of these accounts presents significant challenges for modern historians. The names Hengist and Horsa, meaning stallion and horse respectively, suggest possible mythological or symbolic rather than strictly historical origins. Similar paired heroic brothers appear in other Germanic foundation legends, indicating that these figures may represent literary constructions designed to legitimize later dynastic claims rather than accurate historical records. Archaeological evidence from 5th century Kent shows clear signs of Germanic settlement and political control, but cannot confirm the specific roles attributed to these legendary leaders. The debate over Hengist and Horsa's Jutish identity reflects broader questions about ethnic classification during the migration period. While later sources consistently identify them as Jutish leaders, contemporary evidence suggests more complex ethnic affiliations among Germanic settlers in Britain. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries reveals mixed Scandinavian origins, with individuals showing genetic markers consistent with populations from Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands. This genetic diversity indicates that migration period tribes represented political and military coalitions rather than genetically homogeneous ethnic groups. Archaeological comparison between Danish and British sites provides the most reliable evidence for tracing Jutish migration routes and settlement continuity. Distinctive artifacts found in both regions demonstrate clear technological and stylistic connections that persisted for several generations after initial settlement. The production techniques used for creating specific brooch types, pottery vessels, and metalwork items show such precise correspondence that they indicate either direct craftsman migration or the maintenance of extremely close cultural contacts across the North Sea. The distribution of characteristic Jutish artefacts in Britain follows predictable patterns that reflect both migration routes and subsequent settlement expansion. Early 5th century sites in Kent contain the highest concentrations of distinctively Jutish material culture, with artefact densities decreasing as distance from the primary landing areas increases. This pattern suggests that Kent served as the initial reception area for Jutish migrants, who subsequently established secondary settlements in the Isle of Wight and Hampshire through organised expansion rather than independent migration waves. Ceramic analysis provides particularly detailed evidence for migration continuity. The distinctive angular rim treatment, surface decorations and vessel proportions characteristic of 5th century Jutish pottery in Kent match precisely the ceramic traditions of northern Jutland during the same period. Petrographic analysis of pottery fabrics indicates that some vessels were actually manufactured in Denmark and transported to Britain, while others were produced in Kent using techniques and decorative schemes learned in the homeland. This combination of imported and locally produced ceramics suggests organised community migration that included skilled craftsmen capable of maintaining traditional manufacturing techniques. Metalworking evidence reveals similar patterns of technological continuity across the North Sea. The sophisticated techniques required for producing characteristic Jutish brooches, belt fittings and weapon components appear in Kentish workshops within decades of initial settlement. The quality and consistency of these products indicate that master craftsmen migrated along with their communities, bringing with them the specialised knowledge necessary for maintaining traditional artistic and technological standards. Chemical analysis of bronze and iron artefacts shows that Kentish smiths initially relied on imported raw materials from Scandinavian sources before gradually adapting to British metal supplies. Settlement archaeology provides additional evidence for organised Jutish migration and community establishment. The layout of early Germanic settlements in Kent replicates the organisational patterns observed in contemporary Danish sites, with substantial timber halls serving as focal points for extended family groups. The positioning of these halls relative to agricultural areas, burial grounds, and craft production zones follows spatial arrangements that mirror homeland settlement traditions. This consistency in settlement organisation indicates that entire communities, including their traditional leadership structures and social hierarchies, relocated from Denmark to Britain. The speed with which Germanic settlements achieved political dominance in southeastern Britain suggests that Jutish migrants arrived with established military capabilities and organisational structures. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and warrior graves indicates that Germanic settlers possessed superior military technology and tactical knowledge compared to their Romano-British contemporaries. The systematic nature of Germanic territorial expansion, evidenced by the distribution of early settlement sites and the establishment of defensive positions at strategic locations, demonstrates coordinated military planning rather than opportunistic land grabbing. The transformation of Romano-British administrative structures in areas of Jutish settlement reveals the sophisticated political capabilities that Germanic leaders brought to their new territories. Rather than simply destroying existing systems, Jutish rulers adapted Roman administrative practices to Germanic social structures, creating hybrid governmental forms that combine traditional Germanic leadership concepts with Roman organisational efficiency. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres shows continuity in record-keeping practices and legal procedures, suggesting that Jutish leaders recognised the value of Roman institutional knowledge while adapting it to their own cultural preferences. The establishment of Germanic kingdoms in southeastern Britain required not only military conquest, but also the development of sustainable economic systems capable of supporting substantial immigrant populations. Archaeological evidence indicates that Jutish settlers successfully adapted their traditional agricultural practices to British environmental conditions. while maintaining the craft production capabilities necessary for creating the luxury goods that marked elite status. The rapid development of specialised manufacturing centres in Kent demonstrates that Jutish communities possessed the technological knowledge and organisational skills necessary for establishing complex economic systems in their new territories. The linguistic evidence for Jutish settlement in Britain, while limited by the scarcity of written sources from the migration period, provides additional support for substantial population movement from Denmark. Place name analysis reveals numerous locations in Kent and the Isle of Wight that preserve Germanic linguistic elements consistent with Jutish dialects, rather than Saxon or Anglian variants. These toponymic patterns suggest that Jutish settlers established communities large enough to impose their own naming conventions on the landscape, indicating demographic dominance rather than mere political control over indigenous populations. The successful establishment of Jutish communities in southeastern Britain during the mid-5th century created the foundation for what would become the most politically sophisticated and economically prosperous Germanic kingdom in early medieval England. The Kingdom of Kent emerged from these initial settlements as a distinctive political entity that combined traditional Jutish social structures with adapted Romano-British administrative practices, creating a governmental system that proved remarkably durable and influential throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. Archaeological evidence from the late 5th and early 6th centuries demonstrates the systematic consolidation of Jutish territorial control across Kent, the Isle of Wight, and portions of Hampshire. The distribution of high-status burial sites during this period reveals a coordinated effort to establish administrative centres at strategic locations throughout Jutish territories. Major cemetery complexes at Faversham, Dover and Lyminge contain elaborate warrior graves with standardised weapon sets and imported luxury goods that indicate centralised political authority and organised tribute collection systems. The consistency of grave goods assemblages across these sites suggests that Jutish leaders implemented unified standards for military equipment and elite display items, demonstrating sophisticated organisational capabilities. The territorial boundaries of the Kingdom of Kent stabilised during the late 5th century along natural geographic features that provided both defensive advantages and administrative convenience. The Thames estuary formed the northern boundary, separating Jutish territories from Saxon settlements in Essex and Middlesex. To the west, the kingdom extended along the North Downs to the Surrey border, while the English Channel provided natural protection along the southern frontier. This geographic positioning gave Kent control over crucial maritime trade routes connecting Britain with continental Europe, establishing the economic foundation for the kingdom's subsequent prosperity. The internal organisation of Kentish territory reflected traditional Jutish social hierarchies adapted to British geographic conditions. Archaeological surveys have identified a network of substantial timber halls positioned at regular intervals throughout the kingdom, each serving as the residence and administrative centre for local Jutish nobles. These halls, constructed using traditional Germanic building techniques, but incorporating Romano-British architectural elements, measured between 20 and 35 metres in length and featured elaborate carved decorations that displayed the wealth and status of their occupants. The positioning of these halls relative to Roman roads and existing British settlements indicates that Jutish leaders deliberately integrated their administrative system with existing infrastructure while maintaining their own cultural identity. The development of Canterbury as the primary royal centre of the Kingdom of Kent represents one of the most significant achievements of early Jutish political organisation. The Roman city of Durovanum Cantiacorum provided an ideal foundation for Germanic administrative adaptation, offering substantial stone buildings, defensive walls, and established road connections that Jutish rulers could modify for their own purposes. Archaeological excavations within Canterbury's medieval core have revealed extensive evidence of 6th century Germanic occupation, including the construction of large timber halls within the Roman street grid, and the establishment of specialised craft production areas that manufactured goods for both local consumption and export trade. The transformation of Canterbury from a declining Roman administrative centre into a thriving Germanic royal capital required substantial investment in infrastructure development and population resettlement. Jutish rulers recruited craftsmen, merchants and agricultural workers from throughout their territories to establish permanent communities within the city walls. Archaeological evidence indicates that these settlers brought with them traditional Germanic craft techniques, while adapting to urban living conditions that differed significantly from their rural homeland experiences. The resulting material culture combines distinctively Jutish artistic traditions with Romano-British technological innovations, creating hybrid forms that influenced artistic development throughout southeastern England. The reign of Aethelbert, who ruled Kent from approximately 560 to 616 AD, marked the apex of Jutish political influence in Britain and established precedents that shaped Anglo-Saxon governmental development for centuries. Ethelbert's significance extends far beyond his role as a successful military leader and territorial administrator. His conversion to Christianity around 597 AD and subsequent issuance of the first written law code by an Anglo-Saxon ruler transformed the legal and religious foundations of Germanic kingship in Britain. The survival of Aethelbert's law code, preserved in later manuscripts, provides crucial insights into Jutish social organisation, legal concepts, and administrative practices during the early 7th century. Aethelbert's law code consists of 90 clauses that address a comprehensive range of legal issues including property rights, personal injury compensation, theft penalties, and marriage regulations. The code demonstrates sophisticated understanding of legal principles that combine Germanic customary law with Roman jurisprudential concepts adapted through Christian theological interpretation. The specific compensation schedules outlined in the code reveal detailed social hierarchies within Jutish society, with different penalty rates applied based on the social status of both perpetrators and victims. These distinctions indicate that Kentish society maintained traditional Germanic class divisions while developing more complex legal mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. The legal innovations contained in Aethelbert's code influenced subsequent Anglo-Saxon lawmaking throughout England, establishing precedents for written legal documentation that other Germanic kingdoms gradually adopted. The code's emphasis on monetary compensation rather than physical punishment reflected both Christian theological influence and practical administrative considerations that made centralized legal enforcement more effective. The detailed provisions for protecting church property and clergy demonstrate how Jutish rulers integrated Christian institutional structures into traditional Germanic governmental systems without abandoning their own cultural authority. Ethelbert's conversion to Christianity resulted from complex political calculations that balance religious innovation with traditional Jutish cultural values. The arrival of Augustine's missionary expedition in 597 AD presented both opportunities and challenges for Kentish political leadership. Christianity offered access to continental European diplomatic networks, advanced administrative techniques, and prestigious cultural associations that enhanced royal authority. However, conversion also required careful management of traditional Germanic religious practices and social customs that remained important to Jutish military and agricultural communities. The process of Christianization in Kent proceeded gradually, with Ethelbert maintaining traditional Germanic royal prerogatives while accommodating Christian institutional requirements. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the construction of the first stone churches in Canterbury, including the original cathedral and the monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul. These buildings combined Romano-British architectural traditions with continental European ecclesiastical design principles, creating distinctive architectural forms that influenced church construction throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The positioning of these religious buildings relative to existing Germanic administrative centres indicates careful integration of Christian and traditional governmental functions. The political relationships between Kent and other emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during the 6th and early 7th centuries reveal the sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that Jutish rulers developed to maintain their territorial independence and economic advantages. Kent's strategic position controlling cross-channel trade routes made it both a valuable ally and a potential threat to neighbouring Saxon and Anglian kingdoms. Ethelbert's recognition as Bretwalda, or overlord, by other Anglo-Saxon rulers demonstrates the military and economic power that Kent wielded during its period of greatest influence. Marriage alliances formed crucial components of Kentish diplomatic strategy, with Jutish royal women playing essential roles in establishing and maintaining political relationships with other Germanic kingdoms. Ethelbert's marriage to Bertha, a Frankish princess and Christian, exemplifies how Kentish rulers used matrimonial connections to secure continental European support while maintaining their independence from Saxon territorial expansion. The marriage brought Kent into direct contact with Merovingian political networks, providing access to advanced administrative techniques and luxury trade goods that enhanced royal prestige and governmental effectiveness. The territorial disputes between Kent and neighbouring Saxon kingdoms during the late 6th and early 7th centuries demonstrate both the military capabilities and diplomatic flexibility that characterised Jutish political leadership. Conflicts with Essex over control of London and the Thames estuary required Kent to maintain substantial military forces while simultaneously managing relationships with Frankish allies and Christian ecclesiastical authorities. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites along the Kentish-Essex border indicates systematic defensive preparations that combine traditional Germanic military architecture with Romano-British engineering techniques. The Battle of Wimbledon, fought around 568 AD between Kentish forces and West Saxon armies, illustrates the military challenges that Kent faced in maintaining its territorial integrity against Saxon expansion. While the specific details of this conflict remain unclear due to limited contemporary sources, the battle's outcome appears to have established stable boundaries between Kentish and West Saxon territories that persisted for several generations. The maintenance of these boundaries required continuous military preparedness and diplomatic negotiation that shaped Kentish political development throughout the early Anglo-Saxon period. Economic prosperity formed the foundation of Kent's political influence, with the kingdom's strategic geographic position enabling its rulers to control and profit from trade connections between Britain and continental Europe. Archaeological evidence from trading sites along the Kentish coast reveals extensive commercial activity involving luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured items that circulated throughout northwestern Europe. The port facilities at Dover, Sandwich, and Richborough handled substantial volumes of trade that generated customs revenues and tribute payments that funded royal administration and military activities. The development of specialised craft production centres within Kent demonstrates how Jutish rulers encouraged economic diversification to reduce dependence on agricultural revenues and external trade fluctuations. Archaeological excavations have identified workshop areas in Canterbury, Rochester, and other major settlements where skilled craftsmen produced high-quality metalwork, textiles, and pottery for both local consumption and export markets. These production centres employed traditional Jutish manufacturing techniques, while incorporating technological innovations learned through contact with Frankish and other continental European craftsmen. The monetary system that developed in Kent during the late 6th and early 7th centuries represents one of the earliest attempts by Anglo-Saxon rulers to establish standardised currency systems based on continental European models. The gold tremisses minted in Canterbury during Ethelbert's reign display sophisticated understanding of monetary economics and international trade requirements. These coins, which circulated throughout southeastern England and continental Europe, enhanced Kent's commercial reputation while providing royal administrators with effective tools for collecting taxes and managing economic transactions. The relationship between Kent and Frankish Gaul during this period involved complex networks of political alliance, commercial partnership, and cultural exchange that profoundly influenced Jutish governmental development. Frankish administrative practices, legal concepts, and ecclesiastical organisation provided models that Kentish rulers adapted to their own political needs while maintaining traditional Germanic cultural identity. The regular diplomatic exchanges between Canterbury and Frankish royal courts facilitated the transfer of technological innovations, artistic styles, and governmental techniques that enhanced Kentish administrative capabilities. The influence of Frankish political organisation appears throughout Kentish administrative structures, particularly in the development of written record-keeping systems and standardised legal procedures. The adoption of Latin literacy for official governmental functions, while maintaining Germanic vernacular languages for traditional cultural activities, demonstrates how Jutish rulers balanced innovation with cultural continuity. This linguistic flexibility enabled Kent to participate effectively in international diplomatic networks, while preserving the cultural foundations of royal authority within traditional Germanic social structures. The territorial administration system that evolved in Kent during the early 7th century established precedents for local governmental organisation that influenced Anglo-Saxon political development throughout England. The division of Kentish territory into administrative districts based on traditional Germanic social units, but incorporating Romano-British geographic boundaries, created efficient systems for tax collection, military recruitment, and legal administration. Archaeological evidence indicates that these administrative divisions remained stable for several centuries, suggesting that Jutish rulers successfully balanced centralised royal authority with local community autonomy. The archaeological record reveals that Jutish burial practices evolved significantly from their early continental origins through their establishment in Britain, displaying both continuity with Germanic traditions and adaptation to new religious and social circumstances. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Jutish communities in Kent maintained cremation practices that directly paralleled contemporary customs in northern Denmark, with cremated remains typically placed in ceramic urns, accompanied by personal possessions that reflected the deceased's social status and occupational identity. The cremation cemetery at Eastry provides compelling evidence of these early practices, where excavations have uncovered over 200 urns containing cremated remains alongside distinctive grave goods, including miniature weapons, jewellery fragments, and gaming pieces that survived the cremation process. The cremation urns themselves display characteristic Jutish ceramic traditions, featuring angular shoulder profiles and distinctive rim treatments that distinguish them from contemporary Saxon cremation vessels found in other regions of England. These urns, measuring between 15 and 25 centimetres in height, were carefully constructed with thick walls capable of withstanding high temperatures during the cremation process. The decorative schemes applied to these vessels include horizontal banding, hatched triangular motifs, and stamped geometric patterns that match precisely the ceramic traditions of northern Jutland during the same period. Chemical analysis of ceramic fabrics indicates that early cremation urns in Kent were manufactured using clay sources and tempering materials consistent with Danish geological conditions, suggesting that either the vessels themselves were imported or that Jutish potters brought specific raw materials from their homeland. The transition from cremation to inhumation burial practices among Jutish communities occurred gradually during the late 6th and early 7th centuries, coinciding with the conversion to Christianity under Ethelbert's reign. However, this religious transformation did not immediately eliminate traditional Germanic burial customs. creating a complex archaeological record that demonstrates the gradual integration of Christian and pagan practices. The cemetery at Fingalsham illustrates this transition clearly, with early phases dominated by cremation burials, while later sections contain extended inhumation graves oriented east-west according to Christian requirements, but still accompanied by traditional Germanic grave goods, including weapons, jewellery and personal possessions. The inhumation graves from Christian period Jutish cemeteries reveal distinctive burial practices that set them apart from contemporary Saxon and Anglian communities. Jutish graves typically feature more elaborate wooden coffin construction, evidenced by iron coffin fittings and nail patterns that indicate sophisticated carpentry techniques. The positioning of grave goods within these burials follows specific patterns, with weapons placed along the left side of male burials and jewellery concentrated around the head and chest areas of female interments. This spatial organisation differs markedly from Saxon burial practices, where grave goods are more randomly distributed, suggesting that Jutish communities maintained specific ritual requirements even after adopting Christian burial orientation. The preservation conditions in Kentish chalk soils have allowed for detailed analysis of textile remains associated with Jutish burials, revealing sophisticated weaving techniques and distinctive fabric patterns that reflect both continental Germanic traditions and local innovations. Female graves frequently contain evidence of elaborate dress ensembles, including peplos-style garments secured with characteristic square-headed brooches, underdresses of fine linen, and woolen cloaks fastened with smaller circular brooches. The textile impressions preserved on metal grave goods indicate that Jutish women wore distinctively patterned fabrics, featuring geometric designs woven in contrasting colours, with tablet-woven borders displaying complex interlaced motifs that required considerable technical skill to produce. Male Jutish burials demonstrate equally distinctive clothing traditions, with textile evidence indicating the use of tailored tunics, fitted trousers, and substantial woolen cloaks secured with elaborate belt fittings. The weapon belts found in high-status male graves feature distinctive leatherworking techniques and metal fittings that display characteristic Jutish artistic motifs. These belts, constructed with multiple leather layers and reinforced with metal studs, supported not only weapons but also practical items, including knives, fire steels, and pouches containing personal possessions. The standardization of belt construction techniques across multiple cemetery sites suggests that Jutish communities maintained specific craft traditions for producing these essential masculine accessories. Jutish jewellery traditions display remarkable consistency across both continental and British sites, indicating the preservation of distinctive artistic and technological practices throughout the migration period. The square-headed brooches that appear consistently in female Jutish graves represent some of the most sophisticated metalworking achievements of early medieval Germanic craftsmanship. These brooches, typically measuring between 8 and 12 centimetres in length, feature elaborate animal ornamentation executed in chip-carved technique that creates complex interplays of light and shadow across the brooch surface. The animal designs incorporated into these pieces include stylized quadrupeds, birds, and serpentine creatures arranged in symmetrical compositions that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of decorative balance and artistic proportion. The technical analysis of Jutish square-headed brooches reveals advanced casting and finishing techniques that required considerable metallurgical expertise. The bronze alloys used in these pieces contain carefully controlled proportions of tin and lead that optimize both casting properties and final appearance. The chip-carved decorative elements were executed using specialized tools that created precise geometric cuts, with the deepest recesses often filled with contrasting metal inlays or organic materials that enhance the visual impact of the designs. X-ray analysis has revealed that many brooches contain iron springs and pin mechanisms that were inserted during the casting process, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of multi-material construction techniques. The circular brooches found in Jutish female graves display equally distinctive characteristics, though their smaller size and simpler construction techniques made them more widely accessible across different social levels. These brooches, typically ranging from 3 to 6 centimeters in diameter, feature radial decorative schemes that incorporate geometric patterns, stylized animal motifs, and occasionally runic inscriptions that provide insights into Jutish linguistic traditions. The standardization of decorative motifs across large numbers of circular brooches suggests that Jutish craftsmen worked within established artistic traditions that maintained consistent symbolic meanings and aesthetic preferences across multiple generations. The belt fittings associated with male Jutish burials represent another category of metalwork that demonstrates distinctive artistic and technical traditions. These assemblages typically include buckles, strap ends, and decorative mounts that display characteristic Jutish design elements, including interlaced animal motifs, geometric patterns, and occasionally human figures arranged in narrative compositions. The buckles themselves feature distinctive tongue and plate configurations that differ from contemporary Saxon examples, with Jutish pieces typically displaying more elaborate decorative treatment and sophisticated construction techniques. The strap ends found with these belt sets often terminate in stylized animal heads or geometric designs that complement the overall decorative scheme while serving practical functions for leather attachment. Weapon analysis from Jutish graves reveals distinctive preferences in blade construction, hilt decoration, and overall weapon system organization that distinguish Jutish military equipment from contemporary Saxon and Anglian examples. Jutish spears typically feature longer blade lengths and more elaborate socket decoration compared to weapons found in other Anglo-Saxon contexts. The spearheads, measuring between 25 and 40 centimeters in total length, display sophisticated forging techniques that created strong, flexible blades capable of both thrusting and cutting actions. The sockets often feature decorative inlays of contrasting metals or elaborate surface textures that enhanced both the visual impact and grip security of these weapons. The swords found in high-status Jutish graves demonstrate exceptional metallurgical capabilities and artistic sophistication that reflect both continental Germanic traditions and local innovations developed in Britain. Pattern-welded blades found in Kentish graves display some of the finest examples of early medieval steelworking techniques, with complex twisted steel cores creating distinctive surface patterns that were enhanced through careful etching and polishing. The hilts of these weapons feature elaborate decorative schemes executed in gold, silver and garnet cloison work that rivals the finest contemporary continental European examples. The pommel designs often incorporate distinctive Jutish artistic motifs, including stylized animal heads and geometric patterns that complement the overall weapon aesthetic. Shield analysis from Jutish burial contexts reveals distinctive construction techniques and decorative preferences that set them apart from other Anglo-Saxon military traditions. The shield bosses found in Jutish graves typically feature higher, more pointed profiles compared to Saxon examples, with elaborate decorative treatment including raised ribs, geometric patterns, and occasionally figural representations. The iron construction of these shield bosses demonstrates sophisticated understanding of metallurgical requirements for effective defensive equipment, with carefully controlled carbon content creating optimal combinations of hardness and flexibility. The attachment methods used for securing these bosses to wooden shield boards show distinctive rivet patterns and reinforcement techniques that reflect specific Jutish armouring traditions. Settlement archaeology from Jutish sites in both Denmark and Britain reveals distinctive architectural preferences and spatial organisation patterns that persisted across the migration period. The longhouses, characteristic of early Jutish settlements in northern Denmark, continued to influence building traditions in Kent, though adapted to different environmental conditions and available materials. The timber halls excavated at Yevering and other high-status Jutish sites in Britain measure between 20 and 35 metres in length, constructed using post and beam techniques that created substantial interior spaces suitable for community gatherings and ceremonial functions. The internal organisation of these structures follows consistent patterns, with raised platforms at one end serving as high-status seating areas and central hearths providing both heating and cooking facilities. The construction techniques employed in Jutish hall building demonstrate sophisticated understanding of timber engineering and architectural design principles. The main supporting posts, typically measuring 40 to 50 centimetres in diameter, were set in deep foundation holes that provided stable anchoring for the substantial roof loads. The wall construction utilised wattle and daub techniques that created effective weatherproofing while allowing for decorative treatment of interior surfaces. Archaeological evidence indicates that many Jutish halls featured elaborate carved decoration on internal timber elements, with animal motifs and geometric patterns that complemented the decorative schemes found on contemporary metalwork and textiles. The spatial relationships between different building types within Jutish settlements reveal organised community planning that balance practical requirements with social hierarchies. The positioning of halls relative to subsidiary structures including workshops, storage buildings, and residential quarters follows consistent patterns that maximise both defensive capabilities and administrative efficiency. The workshop areas identified at several Jutish sites show evidence of specialised craft production including metalworking, textile production, and leatherworking, with tool assemblages and waste products indicating high levels of technical expertise and production volume. The agricultural components of Jutish settlements demonstrate sophisticated understanding of land management and agricultural intensification techniques. Field systems associated with Jutish communities typically feature more regular organisation and systematic drainage compared to contemporary British agricultural practices. The evidence for crop storage and processing facilities indicates that Jutish communities maintained substantial agricultural surpluses that supported both local populations and trade activities. The integration of livestock management areas within settlement complexes shows careful planning that balanced animal husbandry requirements with community sanitation and defensive considerations. Linguistic evidence for distinctive Jutish dialects remains fragmentary due to the limited survival of early medieval written sources, but place-name analysis and later linguistic reconstructions provide insights into the distinctive characteristics of Jutish speech patterns. The place names preserved in Kent and the Isle of Wight contain numerous elements that differ from Saxon and Anglian toponymic patterns, suggesting that Jutish settlers imposed their own linguistic conventions on the British landscape. Names ending in "inga", indicating tribal or family group settlements, appear more frequently in areas of documented Jutish settlement, while certain topographic terms show distinctive phonetic developments that reflect Jutish linguistic preferences. The relationship between Jutish dialects and other Germanic languages reveals complex patterns of linguistic development that reflect both continental origins and British innovations. Comparative analysis suggests that Jutish preserved certain archaic Germanic linguistic features that were lost in other Anglo-Saxon dialects, while simultaneously developing distinctive phonetic changes that distinguished it from both continental Germanic languages and neighbouring English dialects. The evidence for Jutish linguistic influence on Kentish Old English includes distinctive vocabulary items, phonetic developments, and grammatical constructions that persisted long after the political integration of Kent into the broader Anglo-Saxon cultural sphere. The runic inscriptions found on Jutish metalwork provide additional evidence for distinctive linguistic traditions. though the limited corpus of surviving examples restricts detailed analysis. The runes found on Jutish brooches and other personal items display letter forms and spelling conventions that show both continuity with continental Germanic runic traditions and local developments that reflect British linguistic influences. These inscriptions typically consist of personal names, ownership markers, or brief protective formulas that provide insights into Jutish naming practices and religious beliefs during the transition from paganism to Christianity. The arrival of Augustine's missionary expedition in 597 AD marked a pivotal transformation in Jutish society that would fundamentally alter religious practices, political structures, and cultural identity throughout the Kingdom of Kent. Pope Gregory the Great's carefully planned mission represented more than a simple evangelical effort. It constituted a sophisticated diplomatic initiative designed to establish Roman ecclesiastical authority in Britain while accommodating existing Germanic political structures. The 40 monks who accompanied Augustine brought with them not only Christian theological doctrine, but also advanced administrative techniques, architectural knowledge, and artistic traditions that would profoundly influence Jutish material culture for generations. The initial reception of Augustine's mission by King Ethelbert demonstrates the complex political calculations that Jutish rulers faced when confronting religious innovation. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury suggests that preparations for the missionaries' arrival had been underway for several months before their actual landing, indicating that diplomatic negotiations through Frankish intermediaries had established preliminary agreements regarding the mission's objectives and operational parameters. The construction of temporary accommodation facilities and the preparation of meeting spaces within Canterbury's Roman walls show that Ethelbert approached the Christian mission as a significant political event requiring careful ceremonial management rather than a purely religious encounter. Ethelbert's decision to meet Augustine on the Isle of Thanet rather than within Canterbury itself reflects traditional Germanic concerns about the potential magical powers of foreign religious practitioners. According to Bede's account, the king insisted that the initial meeting occur in the open air to prevent any supernatural manipulation that might result from enclosed spaces. This precautionary approach demonstrates how traditional Germanic religious beliefs shaped early Christian Jutish interactions, with established magical practices and protective rituals continuing to influence political decision-making even as Christian conversion proceeded. The outdoor meeting also allowed Ethelbert to maintain traditional royal ceremonial protocols, while accommodating Christian liturgical requirements. The conversion process itself unfolded gradually over several months, with Ethelbert carefully balancing Christian theological requirements against traditional Jutish religious obligations and political necessities. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the continued use of traditional Germanic ceremonial sites alongside the construction of the first Christian churches, indicating that religious transformation occurred through accommodation rather than replacement. The king's initial reluctance to abandon traditional religious practices entirely reflects practical concerns about maintaining the loyalty of Jutish military leaders and agricultural communities whose cultural identity remained deeply rooted in Germanic religious traditions. The establishment of Canterbury Cathedral as the primary episcopal seat for Augustine's mission required extensive architectural and administrative planning that demonstrated both Christian ecclesiastical ambition and Jutish royal support. The site selected for the cathedral, within the southeastern section of Canterbury's Roman walls, provided both symbolic continuity with Romano-British Christian traditions and practical advantages, including access to existing stone foundations and water supplies. The initial cathedral structure, constructed between 597 and 602 AD, combined Romano-British architectural elements with continental European ecclesiastical design principles learned from Frankish church-building projects. Archaeological excavations beneath Canterbury Cathedral have revealed the substantial foundations of Augustine's original church, a stone structure measuring approximately 40 metres in length and 20 metres in width, with thick walls capable of supporting significant vertical loads. The construction techniques employed in this building demonstrate sophisticated understanding of masonry engineering, with carefully dressed stone blocks laid in regular courses and reinforced with iron clamps that provided structural stability. The interior organisation included a raised chancel area, side chapels, and burial spaces that accommodated both Christian liturgical requirements and the ceremonial needs of Jutish royal patronage. The development of Canterbury as a centre of English Christianity required not only cathedral construction, but also the establishment of supporting institutions, including monasteries, schools, and administrative facilities that could sustain long-term ecclesiastical operations. The monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul, later known as St. Augustine's Abbey, was founded outside Canterbury's eastern walls on a site that provided both sufficient space for monastic buildings and symbolic separation from secular administrative functions. The abbey's construction, begun around 598 AD, created the first major monastic complex in Anglo-Saxon England, with stone buildings arranged around a central cloister that followed continental European monastic architectural conventions. The artistic and architectural influences introduced through Augustine's mission transformed Jutish material culture by providing access to Mediterranean and continental European artistic traditions that had previously been unavailable in Germanic Britain. The stone carving techniques employed in Canterbury's early churches introduced new decorative motifs, including vine scrolls, geometric interlace patterns, and figural representations that combined Christian symbolic content with Germanic artistic sensibilities. These hybrid decorative schemes appear on architectural fragments, sculptural elements, and portable objects that demonstrate how Jutish craftsmen adapted Christian artistic vocabulary to traditional Germanic aesthetic preferences. The production of illuminated manuscripts at Canterbury during the early 7th century established scriptorial traditions that would influence English book production for centuries. The earliest manuscripts produced under Augustine's direction combined continental European scribal techniques with decorative elements that reflected Germanic artistic traditions, creating distinctive hybrid styles that mark the beginning of Anglo-Saxon manuscript illumination. The Codex Aureus, though produced later in the 8th century, represents the culmination of artistic developments that began with Augustine's mission, demonstrating how Christian manuscript production evolved within Jutish cultural contexts. The syncretistic religious practices that emerged during the conversion period reveal how Jutish communities negotiated the transition from traditional Germanic paganism to Christian orthodoxy, without completely abandoning ancestral spiritual traditions. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites shows the gradual modification of burial practices, with traditional grave goods continuing to appear in Christian-oriented burials for several generations after official conversion. The cemetery at Eastry demonstrates this transition clearly, with graves from the early 7th century containing both Christian symbols and traditional Germanic protective amulets, indicating that religious transformation occurred through gradual accommodation rather than immediate replacement. Traditional Jutish religious practices centered around seasonal agricultural festivals, ancestor veneration, and warrior cult activities that provided essential social cohesion and cultural identity for Germanic communities. The Christian conversion process required careful integration of these established religious functions with Christian liturgical cycles and theological concepts. Archaeological evidence suggests that many traditional festival sites continue to be used for community gatherings, but with Christian ceremonial elements gradually replacing pagan ritual activities. The positioning of early churches relative to traditional sacred sites indicates deliberate attempts to transfer religious authority from pagan to Christian contexts while maintaining familiar geographic associations. The role of Jutish queens in facilitating Christian conversion and cultural exchange proved crucial for the success of Augustine's mission and the long-term establishment of Christianity in Kent. Queen Bertha, Ethelbert's Frankish wife, had maintained Christian religious practices throughout her marriage, providing a model for how Christian and Germanic cultural elements could coexist within royal households. Her private chapel of St. Martin, located outside Canterbury's walls, served as the initial base for Augustine's missionary activities and demonstrated that Christian worship could be accommodated within traditional Germanic political structures without threatening royal authority. Bertha's influence extended beyond simple religious patronage to encompass diplomatic, cultural and economic activities that enhance Kent's international connections and political prestige. Her Frankish origins provided direct access to Merovingian political networks, while her Christian faith created opportunities for ecclesiastical diplomacy that strengthened Kent's position relative to other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The marriage alliance between Ethelbert and Bertha had been negotiated with specific provisions, allowing her to maintain Christian religious practices, indicating that Jutish political leaders recognised the potential advantages of religious flexibility in international diplomatic contexts. The educational and cultural programmes established under Bertha's patronage introduced Jutish society to continental European intellectual traditions that significantly enhanced administrative capabilities and artistic development. The school established at Canterbury for training clergy and administrative personnel provided instruction in Latin literacy, legal procedures, and ecclesiastical organisation that created an educated class capable of managing complex governmental and religious institutions. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury includes writing implements, book clasps, and other scholarly materials that demonstrate the rapid development of literary culture within Jutish society following Christian conversion. The diplomatic implications of Christian conversion extended far beyond religious transformation to encompass political relationships with continental European powers and neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Kent's adoption of Christianity aligned the kingdom with Frankish political interests, while distinguishing it from pagan Saxon and Anglian rulers who remained committed to traditional Germanic religious practices. This religious differentiation provided Kent with diplomatic advantages in negotiations with Christian continental powers, while creating potential conflicts with pagan neighbouring kingdoms that viewed Christian conversion as a political betrayal of Germanic cultural identity. The economic consequences of Christian conversion included both costs and benefits that significantly influenced Kent's political development during the early 7th century. The construction of churches, monasteries, and supporting institutions required substantial financial investment that strained royal resources while creating new opportunities for craft production and trade. The ecclesiastical buildings under construction in Canterbury attracted skilled craftsmen from throughout northwestern Europe, creating temporary but significant economic stimulus that enhanced Kent's reputation as a centre for sophisticated artistic and architectural production. The legal and administrative changes that accompanied Christian conversion transformed Jutish governmental structures by introducing written legal codes, standardised administrative procedures, and systematic record-keeping practices that enhanced royal authority and bureaucratic efficiency. Ethelbert's law code, issued around 603 AD, represents the first attempt by an Anglo-Saxon ruler to create comprehensive written legal standards that combined Germanic customary law with Christian theological principles. The code's provisions for protecting church property, regulating clerical conduct, and establishing penalties for crimes against religious personnel demonstrate how Christian institutional requirements were integrated into traditional Germanic legal frameworks. The missionary activities that expanded beyond Kent into other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms utilised Jutish political connections and military capabilities to establish Christian communities in previously pagan territories. The missions to Essex and East Anglia during the early 7th century relied heavily on Kentish political support and ecclesiastical resources. with Jutish clergy and administrators playing crucial roles in establishing Christian institutions throughout southeastern England. These missionary efforts enhanced Kent's political influence while creating religious obligations that sometimes conflicted with traditional Germanic military and diplomatic practices. The resistance to Christian conversion among certain segments of Jutish society created internal political tensions that required careful management by royal authorities seeking to maintain social cohesion while implementing religious transformation. Archaeological evidence suggests that rural agricultural communities maintained traditional religious practices longer than urban populations, with pagan burial customs and ritual activities continuing in remote areas for several generations after official conversion. The gradual nature of religious change in these communities indicates that Christian conversion succeeded through accommodation and gradual cultural modification, rather than immediate theological transformation. The architectural legacy of Augustine's mission established building traditions that influenced church construction throughout Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. The techniques introduced by continental craftsmen working on Canterbury's early churches provided local builders with advanced masonry skills, decorative carving methods, and structural engineering knowledge that enhanced the sophistication of subsequent ecclesiastical architecture. The distinctive combination of Romano-British, continental European, and Germanic architectural elements that emerged in Kent created hybrid building styles that marked the beginning of recognisably English ecclesiastical architecture. The manuscript production traditions established at Canterbury during the conversion period created scriptorial practices that preserve both Christian theological texts and Germanic cultural materials, ensuring the survival of important historical and literary sources. The scriptorium's activities included copying continental European religious texts, producing administrative documents for royal and ecclesiastical use, and creating original compositions that combined Christian and Germanic literary traditions. The preservation of vernacular Germanic poetry alongside Latin religious texts demonstrates how Christian institutions served to maintain Germanic cultural identity while promoting religious transformation. The long-term consequences of religious conversion for Jutish cultural identity involved complex negotiations between Christian theological requirements and traditional Germanic social values that shaped Anglo-Saxon cultural development for centuries. The successful integration of Christian and Germanic elements in Kent provided a model for religious transformation that other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually adopted, establishing patterns of cultural accommodation that characterised English Christianity throughout the medieval period. The distinctive features of Kentish Christianity, including its emphasis on royal patronage, continental European connections, and administrative sophistication, reflected the particular characteristics of Jutish society while contributing to the broader development of English ecclesiastical traditions. While the Kingdom of Kent dominated Jutish political and cultural development in Britain, substantial evidence demonstrates that Jutish communities established significant settlements beyond the southeastern heartland, creating smaller but nonetheless important political entities that maintained distinctive cultural identities while adapting to diverse regional circumstances. The Isle of Wight emerged as the most substantial of these secondary Jutish territories, developing its own royal dynasty and administrative structures that paralleled but remained independent from Kentish political control. Archaeological investigations across the island have revealed extensive evidence of organised Jutish settlement, dating from the late 5th century, with material culture assemblages that display clear continuity with both continental Danish traditions and contemporary Kentish developments. The establishment of Jutish political authority on the Isle of Wight required different strategic approaches compared to the mainland settlements in Kent, as the island's geographic isolation provided both defensive advantages and economic limitations that shaped political development. The earliest Jutish settlements concentrated around the island's eastern and northern coasts, where natural harbours provided access to cross-channel trade routes and communication with continental European markets. Cemetery evidence from Carisbrooke and Arreton demonstrates substantial Jutish populations by the early 6th century, with burial assemblages containing distinctive square-headed brooches, weapon sets, and ceramic vessels that match precisely the material culture found in contemporary Kentish sites. The Royal Cemetery at Bochum Down provides compelling evidence for an independent Jutish dynasty ruling the Isle of Wight during the 6th and early 7th centuries. Excavations conducted in the 1960s uncovered a series of exceptionally wealthy burials containing elaborate grave goods that rival the most prestigious Kentish royal interments. The central burial, likely representing a 6th century king, contained a pattern-welded sword with gold and garnet pommel fittings, an elaborate shield with decorative bronze fittings, and a collection of personal ornaments including gold buckles and strap ends that demonstrate the highest levels of Germanic craftsmanship. The positioning of subsidiary burials around this central grave suggests a burial ground reserved for royal family members and high-ranking nobles, indicating sophisticated political hierarchies within Wight's Jutish community. The material culture from Bochum Down reveals distinctive artistic traditions that combined standard Jutish decorative motifs with local innovations that reflected the island's particular cultural circumstances. The metalwork displays characteristic Jutish animal ornamentation and geometric patterns, but executed with distinctive stylistic variations that suggest local workshop traditions. Chemical analysis of the bronze and gold objects indicates that raw materials were imported from continental European sources, demonstrating that Wight's Jutish rulers maintained independent trade relationships, rather than relying entirely on Kentish commercial networks. This economic independence provided the foundation for political autonomy that persisted until the island's eventual incorporation into the West Saxon Kingdom during the late 7th century. Settlement archaeology on the Isle of Wight reveals organised communities that replicated mainland Jutish social structures while adapting to the island's particular environmental conditions. The excavated hall complex at Carisbrooke demonstrates sophisticated timber construction techniques that created substantial buildings capable of accommodating large community gatherings and ceremonial functions. The hall measured approximately 28 metres in length and featured elaborate carved decorations on internal timber elements, with animal motifs and geometric patterns that matched contemporary decorative schemes found on Jutish metalwork and textiles. The positioning of subsidiary buildings around the main hall followed spatial arrangements that balance practical requirements with social hierarchies, creating organised settlement complexes that served both residential and administrative functions. The agricultural systems developed by Jutish communities on the Isle of Wight demonstrate sophisticated land management techniques that maximise the island's limited agricultural potential while supporting substantial populations. Field system analysis reveals organised cultivation areas with systematic drainage and soil improvement techniques that enhanced agricultural productivity. The evidence for specialised crop storage and processing facilities indicates that Wight's Jutish communities maintained agricultural surpluses sufficient to support craft production activities and trade relationships with mainland communities. The integration of livestock management areas within settlement complexes shows careful planning that balanced animal husbandry requirements with community defensive considerations. Archaeological evidence from Hampshire reveals scattered Jutish settlements that extended Jutish territorial control beyond the Isle of Wight into portions of the mainland, though these communities appear to have been smaller and less politically organised than their island counterparts. Cemetery sites at Droxford, Petersfield, and other locations in southern Hampshire contain burial assemblages with characteristic Jutish grave goods, including distinctive brooches, weapon sets, and ceramic vessels that demonstrate clear cultural connections with both Kent and the Isle of Wight. However, the smaller scale of these cemeteries and the mixed nature of their grave-good assemblages suggest that Hampshire's Jutish communities represented frontier settlements rather than major population centres. The Jutish presence in Hampshire appears to have been concentrated in areas that provided strategic control over important transportation routes and natural resources, particularly the river valleys that connected the coast with inland territories. The positioning of known Jutish sites relative to Roman roads and river crossings indicates that these communities served important commercial and military functions within the broader network of Jutish territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hampshire's Jutish settlements maintained regular contact with both Kent and the Isle of Wight, sharing material culture traditions and probably participating in coordinated political and military activities. The relationship between Kent and the outlying Jutish territories involved complex networks of political alliance, economic cooperation and cultural exchange that maintained Jutish ethnic identity while accommodating regional variations in political organisation. Documentary evidence from the early 7th century indicates that the Isle of Wight maintained its own royal dynasty, while acknowledging some form of Kentish overlordship, suggesting political arrangements that balanced local autonomy with broader Jutish solidarity. The smaller Hampshire settlements appear to have been more directly integrated into Kentish administrative systems, though they retained distinctive cultural characteristics that marked them as ethnically Jutish rather than Saxon communities. The archaeological evidence for possible Jutish presence in other parts of southern England remains more controversial, with scholars debating the significance of scattered finds that display Jutish characteristics but occur in regions where documentary sources provide no clear evidence for organised Jutish settlement. Isolated discoveries of characteristic Jutish brooches and other artefacts in Surrey, Sussex and Dorset have been interpreted variously as evidence for Jutish trading activities, individual migration, or cultural exchange rather than substantial community settlement. The distribution patterns of these finds suggest that Jutish cultural influence extended beyond the core territories through commercial relationships and intermarriage with neighbouring Germanic communities. The cemetery at Alfriston in Sussex provides one of the most intriguing examples of possible Jutish cultural influence beyond the documented settlement areas. Several graves from this site contain distinctive square-headed brooches and other artefacts that display clear Jutish stylistic characteristics, though the overall cemetery assemblage includes substantial Saxon material culture as well. The mixed nature of this evidence suggests either intermarriage between Jutish and Saxon communities, or the adoption of Jutish cultural elements by Saxon populations through trade and cultural exchange. Similar mixed assemblages from other Sussex sites indicate that cultural boundaries between Germanic groups were more fluid than later documentary sources suggest. The integration of outlying Jutish communities with local British populations created complex cultural landscapes where Germanic and Romano-British traditions merged in distinctive regional variations. Archaeological evidence from several sites indicates that Jutish settlers established communities alongside existing British populations, rather than completely displacing earlier inhabitants. The material culture from these mixed communities displays hybrid characteristics that combine Jutish decorative motifs with Romano-British technological traditions and local artistic preferences. This cultural blending created distinctive regional identities that maintained Jutish ethnic markers while incorporating elements from multiple cultural traditions. The process of cultural integration appears to have varied significantly depending on local circumstances, with some areas showing rapid adoption of Jutish material culture by British populations, while others maintained more distinct cultural boundaries. Cemetery evidence suggests that intermarriage between Jutish and British communities was relatively common, particularly in frontier areas where Jutish populations were smaller and more dependent on local cooperation for economic and military security. The children of these mixed marriages often display material culture assemblages that combine elements from both cultural traditions, creating new hybrid identities that contributed to the complex ethnic landscape of early medieval southern England. The gradual absorption of outlying Jutish territories into expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms represents one of the most significant political developments of the 7th and 8th centuries, fundamentally altering the territorial organisation of southern England. The process began with West Saxon expansion eastward from their core territories in Wiltshire and Dorset, bringing them into direct contact with Jutish communities in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Initial conflicts between these kingdoms appear to have been limited in scope, with both sides recognising the advantages of peaceful coexistence and commercial cooperation over costly territorial warfare. The West Saxon conquest of the Isle of Wight, traditionally dated to 686 AD under King Caedwalla, marked the end of independent Jutish political authority in southern England outside of Kent. Archaeological evidence from this period shows significant changes in material culture and settlement organisation that reflect the island's integration into West Saxon administrative systems. However, the transition appears to have been relatively peaceful, with many Jutish cultural traditions continuing under West Saxon rule. The survival of distinctive Jutish place names and archaeological evidence for continued craft production using traditional techniques suggests that cultural assimilation occurred gradually rather than through immediate replacement. The incorporation of Hampshire's Jutish communities into Wessex followed similar patterns, with West Saxon political control being established through negotiated agreements rather than military conquest. The smaller scale of these Jutish settlements made resistance impractical, while the strategic value of their locations made peaceful incorporation advantageous for both sides. Archaeological evidence indicates that many Jutish families remained in their traditional territories under West Saxon rule, maintaining their cultural identity while adapting to new political circumstances. The continued use of traditional Jutish burial practices and material culture styles for several generations after political incorporation demonstrates the persistence of ethnic identity despite changing political allegiances. The administrative integration of former Jutish territories into West Saxon governmental systems required careful accommodation of existing social structures and legal traditions. The West Saxon rulers appear to have recognised the value of maintaining local administrative expertise while implementing standardised legal and taxation systems across their expanded territories. Documentary evidence suggests that many Jutish nobles retained their local authority under West Saxon overlordship, creating hybrid administrative systems that combined West Saxon political control with traditional Jutish social organisation. The economic consequences of political integration varied significantly depending on local circumstances and the specific terms of incorporation agreements. The Isle of Wight's strategic position controlling cross-channel trade routes made it particularly valuable to West Saxon rulers, who invested in port facilities and commercial infrastructure that enhanced the island's economic importance. Archaeological evidence indicates increased trade activity and craft production following West Saxon incorporation, suggesting that political stability and access to larger markets benefited the island's economy despite the loss of political independence. The cultural legacy of the outlying Jutish territories persisted long after their political incorporation into other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, influencing local traditions, artistic development, and social organisation in ways that remained visible for centuries. Place name evidence reveals the survival of Jutish linguistic elements in areas of former Jutish settlement, with distinctive toponymic patterns that differ from standard West Saxon naming conventions. These linguistic survivals provide evidence for the continued presence of Jutish-speaking populations and the maintenance of cultural identity despite political assimilation. Archaeological evidence from the 8th and 9th centuries shows the gradual evolution of material culture traditions in former Jutish territories, with traditional Jutish decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques being adapted to new political and cultural circumstances. The persistence of distinctive artistic traditions in metalwork, pottery production, and textile manufacturing demonstrates the continued influence of Jutish cultural identity on regional development. These traditions eventually merged with broader Anglo-Saxon cultural patterns, but retained distinctive characteristics that marked their Jutish origins and contributed to the complex cultural landscape of early medieval England. The religious transformation of outlying Jutish territories followed patterns similar to those observed in Kent, though often occurring later and with greater accommodation of local traditional practices. The establishment of Christian churches and monasteries in former Jutish areas typically involved the adaptation of existing sacred sites, rather than the construction of entirely new religious complexes. Archaeological evidence suggests that many traditional Jutish religious practices continued alongside Christian observances for several generations, creating syncretic religious traditions that combine Germanic and Christian elements in distinctive regional variations. The consolidation of Mercian power under King Offa during the late 8th century fundamentally altered the political landscape of southeastern England, placing unprecedented pressure on Kentish independence and forcing Jutish rulers to navigate increasingly complex diplomatic relationships with their expanding neighbours. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury and other major Kentish centres reveals significant changes in material culture and administrative practices during this period, indicating that Mercian influence extended far beyond simple military dominance to encompass economic control and cultural transformation. The distinctive Jutish artistic traditions that had flourished during the 6th and 7th centuries began showing clear Mercian stylistic influences, particularly in metalwork and manuscript illumination, suggesting that cultural assimilation accompanied political subordination. The Battle of Otford in 776 AD marked a crucial turning point in Kentish-Mercian relations, though the specific details of this engagement remain obscured by limited contemporary documentation. Archaeological investigations near the battle site have uncovered scattered weapon fragments and disturbed burial evidence that suggests a significant military encounter, though the scale and outcome remain subjects of scholarly debate. What appears certain is that this conflict established Mercian military superiority over Kent, while simultaneously demonstrating the continued resistance capabilities of Jutish forces. The aftermath of Otford saw the installation of Mercian-appointed governors in key Kentish administrative centres, effectively ending the political independence that had characterised the kingdom since its 5th century establishment. The gradual erosion of Kentish autonomy manifested itself through systematic changes in administrative structures, legal procedures, and economic relationships that integrated the former kingdom into Mercian governmental systems. Documentary evidence from Canterbury's cathedral archives reveals the replacement of traditional Jutish legal codes with Mercian administrative practices, though local customary laws continued to operate alongside the imposed systems. The taxation records from this period indicate substantial tribute payments flowing from Kent to Mercian royal centres, representing a fundamental shift from the economic independence that had previously characterised Jutish political organisation. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites shows corresponding changes in grave good assemblages, with traditional Jutish status markers being replaced by Mercian-influenced luxury items that reflected the new political realities. The transformation of Canterbury from an independent royal centre into a Mercian administrative outpost required extensive modifications to existing governmental and ecclesiastical structures. The cathedral complex underwent significant architectural changes during this period, with new construction projects that incorporated Mercian artistic preferences while maintaining the basic organisational framework established during Augustine's mission. The scriptorium's manuscript production shifted toward texts that served Mercian administrative needs, though the preservation of earlier Kentish documents suggests that local clerical authorities maintained some degree of cultural autonomy despite political subordination. Archaeological excavations within the cathedral precinct have revealed substantial building modifications that created additional administrative spaces while reducing the ceremonial areas associated with independent royal functions. The economic consequences of Mercian domination extended throughout Kentish society, affecting craft production, agricultural organisation, and commercial relationships in ways that fundamentally altered traditional Jutish social structures. The specialised workshops that had produced distinctive Kentish metalwork and textiles experienced significant disruption as Mercian authorities redirected production toward goods that served broader political needs rather than local cultural preferences. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows changes in manufacturing techniques and decorative schemes that reflect the imposition of Mercian artistic standards, though traditional Jutish motifs continued to appear in modified forms that demonstrated cultural persistence despite political pressure. The disruption of traditional trade relationships proved particularly damaging to Kentish economic stability, as Mercian control over cross-channel commerce reduced the revenues that had previously supported royal administration and military activities. The port facilities at Dover, Sandwich, and other coastal centres came under direct Mercian supervision, with customs revenues being diverted to support Mercian rather than Kentish political priorities. Archaeological evidence from trading sites reveals changes in the types and quantities of imported goods, suggesting that commercial relationships with continental European markets became increasingly regulated by Mercian rather than Kentish authorities. The reduction in luxury imports found in contemporary Kentish elite burials reflects the economic constraints that accompanied political subordination. The emergence of Wessex as a major political force during the early 9th century created additional pressures on the already weakened Kentish kingdom, as West Saxon territorial expansion brought them into direct competition with both Mercian and Jutish interests. The complex diplomatic relationships between these three kingdoms required careful navigation by Kentish leaders seeking to maintain some degree of autonomy while avoiding complete absorption by either expanding power. Archaeological evidence from border regions reveals increased fortification activities and military preparations that indicate heightened tensions between competing territorial claims. The construction of defensive earthworks and the establishment of fortified settlements along traditional boundaries demonstrate the militarization of political relationships that characterized this period of political instability. King Egbert's victory over the Mercians at the Battle of Ellendun in 825 AD fundamentally altered the political balance of southern England, creating opportunities for West Saxon expansion while simultaneously threatening the remaining vestiges of Kentish independence. The immediate aftermath of this battle saw West Saxon forces advancing rapidly through southeastern England, encountering limited resistance from Kentish armies that had been weakened by decades of Mercian domination. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury suggests that the city submitted to West Saxon authority without significant military resistance, though the transition involved substantial changes in administrative personnel and governmental procedures. The formal incorporation of Kent into the West Saxon kingdom under Egbert's direct rule marked the end of independent Jutish political authority in Britain, though the process of integration proved more complex than simple military conquest. West Saxon administrators recognised the value of maintaining existing ecclesiastical and commercial structures, while implementing standardised legal and taxation systems that served broader political objectives. The cathedral authorities in Canterbury retained significant autonomy in religious matters, while secular administration came under direct West Saxon control through appointed governors who replaced the traditional Jutish royal household. Archaeological evidence from elite residential sites shows the displacement of traditional Kentish nobility by West Saxon administrators, though many local families retained their properties under the new political arrangements. The administrative integration of Kent into Wessex required careful accommodation of existing social structures and legal traditions that had developed over 3 centuries of independent political development. Alfred the Great's legal reforms during the late 9th century formally codified the relationship between Kentish, customary law and West Saxon administrative practices, creating hybrid legal systems that maintained local cultural identity while ensuring political compliance. The survival of distinctive Kentish legal procedures in Alfred's law code demonstrates the persistence of Jutish cultural traditions despite political assimilation, though these practices operated within frameworks established by West Saxon royal authority, rather than independent Jutish political institutions. The impact of Viking raids on Jutish territories began during the 830s and intensified throughout the 9th century, creating military pressures that exceeded the defensive capabilities of both independent and subordinated Kentish forces. The first recorded Viking attack on Canterbury occurred in 851 AD, when a substantial Danish fleet sailed up the Thames and launched coordinated assaults on both London and Canterbury simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury's defensive walls shows extensive damage and hasty repair work that corresponds to this period, with building materials scavenged from Roman structures being used to reinforce medieval fortifications. The cathedral treasury records substantial losses of precious objects and manuscripts, indicating that the raiders successfully penetrated the city's defences and conducted systematic looting operations. The strategic importance of Kent's coastal position made it a primary target for Viking raiding activities, as the numerous harbours and river mouths provided ideal bases for launching attacks on both English and continental European targets. The Thames estuary became a particular focus of Viking activity, with raiding fleets establishing temporary camps on the Isle of Sheppey and other strategic locations that provided access to both river and coastal navigation routes. Archaeological excavations on Sheppey have uncovered extensive evidence of 9th century Viking occupation, including distinctive Scandinavian metalwork, ship fittings, and burial practices that demonstrate substantial Norse settlement rather than temporary raiding bases. The Viking establishment of winter camps in Kent during the 850s and 860s created sustained military pressure that overwhelmed local defensive capabilities and required coordinated responses from West Saxon royal forces. The camp at Thanet, established in 865 AD, served as a base for Viking operations throughout southeastern England for several years, demonstrating the raiders' ability to maintain permanent military presence in Jutish territories. Archaeological evidence from the Thanet site reveals substantial defensive earthworks and organised settlement areas that accommodated hundreds of warriors along with their equipment, supplies and captured goods. The scale of these installations indicates that Viking forces viewed Kent as conquered territory suitable for long-term occupation rather than merely temporary raiding targets. The systematic Viking attacks on Canterbury's religious institutions represented deliberate targeting of the wealth and symbolic importance of England's primary ecclesiastical centre. The raid of 1011 AD proved particularly devastating, resulting in the capture of Archbishop Althea and the extraction of massive tribute payments that drained resources throughout southeastern England. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic looting of cathedral treasures, the destruction of manuscripts and religious artefacts, and the disruption of ecclesiastical administration that had served as the foundation of Kentish cultural identity since Augustine's mission. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury's monastic sites shows extensive fire damage and deliberate destruction that corresponds to documented Viking attacks, with many buildings requiring complete reconstruction during subsequent recovery periods. The coastal settlements of Kent suffered repeated Viking attacks that disrupted traditional economic activities and forced substantial population movements away from vulnerable shoreline locations. The ports of Dover, Sandwich, and Richborough experienced systematic raiding that destroyed harbour facilities commercial buildings, and residential areas while capturing or killing substantial portions of their populations. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals layers of destruction debris containing burned timber, melted metal objects, and scattered human remains that testify to the violence and thoroughness of Viking attacks. The subsequent abandonment of many coastal settlements and the establishment of new communities in more defensible inland locations demonstrate the profound impact of Viking raiding on traditional Jutish settlement patterns. The agricultural disruption caused by Viking raids extended far beyond immediate battle damage to encompass systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and farming infrastructure that undermined the economic foundations of Jutish society. Contemporary accounts describe Viking forces deliberately destroying grain stores, killing livestock, and burning agricultural buildings to prevent local populations from supporting resistance activities. Archaeological evidence from rural settlement sites shows widespread abandonment during peak raiding periods, with many farmsteads remaining unoccupied for decades after initial attacks. The disruption of agricultural production created food shortages that weakened overall population health and reduced the demographic resources available for military defence. The Viking impact on Jutish territories extended beyond immediate military destruction to encompass long-term cultural and demographic changes that fundamentally altered the ethnic composition of southeastern England. The establishment of Scandinavian settlements in areas of former Jutish occupation introduced new cultural traditions, linguistic influences, and social structures that blended with surviving Germanic elements to create hybrid communities. Archaeological evidence from mixed Anglo-Scandinavian sites reveals material culture assemblages that combine traditional English and Norse elements in distinctive regional variations that reflect the complex cultural negotiations required for coexistence between different ethnic groups. The situation in Denmark during this same period reveals parallel processes of political consolidation and Viking expansion that affected Jutish homeland territories in ways that mirrored the pressures experienced in Britain. The emergence of unified Danish royal authority under Harald Bluetooth during the late 10th century created centralized political control that absorbed traditional Jutish tribal territories into broader Scandinavian administrative systems. Archaeological evidence from northern Jutland shows substantial changes in settlement organization and material culture that reflect the integration of formerly independent Jutish communities into Danish royal administrative structures. The construction of ring fortresses and the standardization of military equipment indicate systematic efforts to transform traditional tribal societies into components of centralized royal authority. The parallel experiences of Jutish communities in both Britain and Denmark demonstrate how the political consolidation characteristic of the 9th and 10th centuries affected Germanic tribal societies throughout northwestern Europe. The pressures that eliminated independent Jutish political authority in Kent operated simultaneously in Jutish homeland territories, where Danish royal expansion achieved similar results through different methods. The archaeological evidence from both regions shows comparable patterns of cultural transformation, political subordination, and demographic change that reflect broader historical processes rather than isolated regional developments. The ultimate disappearance of distinctive Jutish political identity resulted from these parallel pressures operating across the North Sea world that had originally connected Jutish communities in Denmark and Britain. The administrative records from Alfred's reign demonstrate how West Saxon authorities managed the integration of former Jutish territories while maintaining defensive capabilities against continuing Viking threats. The establishment of the Burr system in Kent created fortified centres at Canterbury, Rochester, and other strategic locations that provided both administrative coordination and military defence against Viking attacks. Archaeological excavations at these Burr sites reveal substantial defensive earthworks, organised street systems, and planned residential areas that accommodated both military garrisons and civilian populations. The success of these defensive measures in limiting Viking penetration of Kentish territories demonstrates the effectiveness of West Saxon administrative and military innovations, though at the cost of traditional Jutish political independence and cultural autonomy. The transformation of Jutish society during the 9th through 12th centuries represents a complex process of cultural negotiation that balanced the pressures of political integration with determined efforts to preserve distinctive ethnic traditions and legal practices. As West Saxon authority consolidated throughout southeastern England and Danish royal power absorbed Jutish homeland territories, the descendants of the original Jutish settlers found themselves navigating increasingly sophisticated strategies for maintaining cultural identity within expanding Anglo-Saxon administrative systems. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury, Rochester, and other former Jutish centres reveals material culture assemblages that demonstrate both adaptation to broader English cultural norms and the persistence of distinctively Jutish manufacturing techniques, decorative preferences, and social organisation patterns. The gradual integration of Jutish populations into Anglo-Saxon society proceeded through multiple generations of intermarriage, economic cooperation, and administrative collaboration that created hybrid cultural identities while preserving core elements of Germanic tribal tradition. Cemetery evidence from the 9th and 10th centuries shows burial assemblages that combine traditional Jutish grave goods with Anglo-Saxon status markers, indicating that ethnic identity remained significant even as political boundaries shifted. The cemetery at Eastry provides particularly clear evidence of this cultural blending, with graves containing characteristic Jutish brooches alongside Anglo-Saxon weaponry and Christian religious symbols that reflect the complex negotiations required for maintaining cultural distinctiveness within integrated political systems. The persistence of Jutish craft traditions within Anglo-Saxon workshops demonstrates how ethnic communities preserved technical knowledge and artistic preferences despite changing political circumstances. Metalworking analysis from Canterbury reveals the continued production of brooches, belt fittings, and decorative objects that display traditional Jutish design elements, though adapted to serve broader market demands and aesthetic preferences. The distinctive animal ornamentation and geometric patterns that had characterized early Jutish metalwork evolved during this period to incorporate Anglo-Saxon and Carolingian artistic influences while maintaining recognizable Jutish stylistic elements. Chemical analysis of bronze alloys indicates that Jutish craftsmen continued using traditional metalworking techniques learned from their ancestors, though they adapted these methods to work with new raw material sources and different customer requirements. Pottery production in former Jutish territories reveals similar patterns of cultural continuity within changing economic contexts. The angular rim treatments and decorative schemes characteristic of early Jutish ceramics persisted in modified forms throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, though vessel shapes and surface treatments show increasing standardization that reflects integration into broader Anglo-Saxon commercial networks. Petrographic analysis of ceramic fabrics demonstrates that Jutish potters maintained traditional clay preparation and firing techniques while adapting their products to serve expanding regional markets that demanded different functional characteristics and aesthetic preferences. Textile production evidence from archaeological contexts reveals the persistence of distinctive Jutish weaving techniques and decorative patterns that continue to mark ethnic identity long after political integration. The tablet weaving traditions that had produced elaborate borders for Jutish garments evolved during this period to create decorative elements for Anglo-Saxon clothing styles, demonstrating how traditional craft and knowledge adapted to serve new cultural requirements while maintaining technical distinctiveness. Analysis of textile impressions preserved on metal objects shows that Jutish communities continued producing fabrics with characteristic geometric patterns and colour combinations, that reflected ancestral design preferences, though these textiles were incorporated into garment styles that conformed to broader Anglo-Saxon fashion trends. The architectural evidence from former Jutish settlements reveals building traditions that combine traditional Germanic construction techniques with Anglo-Saxon and Norman innovations to create distinctive regional styles. The timber halls excavated at Yevering and other high-status sites show modifications during the 9th and 10th centuries that adapted traditional Jutish spatial organisation to accommodate Anglo-Saxon administrative and ceremonial requirements. These buildings retained the substantial scale and internal organisation patterns characteristic of Germanic hall construction, while incorporating stone foundations, improved heating systems, and decorative elements that reflected integration into Anglo-Saxon elite culture. The persistence of traditional spatial relationships within these modified structures demonstrates how architectural practices served to maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing political and social circumstances. The legal traditions that survived within the Kentish legal code represent perhaps the most significant evidence for Jutish cultural persistence within Anglo-Saxon governmental systems. The distinctive compensation schedules, property rights provisions, and procedural requirements that characterised early Jutish law continue to operate alongside Anglo-Saxon legal innovations throughout the medieval period, creating hybrid legal systems that accommodated both traditional Germanic customs and evolving administrative requirements. Documentary analysis reveals that Kentish legal procedures retained distinctive characteristics that differed from standard Anglo-Saxon practices, particularly in matters involving property inheritance, marriage regulations, and compensation for personal injury. These legal distinctions provided formal mechanisms for preserving Jutish cultural practices within the broader framework of Anglo-Saxon governmental authority. The survival of Kentish legal distinctiveness required continuous negotiation between local communities seeking to maintain traditional practices and royal administrators implementing standardised legal procedures throughout the kingdom. The law codes issued by Alfred the Great and his successors demonstrate systematic efforts to accommodate Kentish legal traditions while ensuring compliance with royal authority and administrative efficiency. The specific provisions that recognise traditional Kentish inheritance practices, marriage customs, and compensation schedules indicate that Anglo-Saxon rulers understood the political importance of maintaining local cultural autonomy within centralised governmental systems. Archaeological evidence from legal assembly sites shows continued use of traditional meeting places for conducting legal proceedings according to customary procedures, though these activities operated within frameworks established by royal administrative authority. The ecclesiastical records from Canterbury Cathedral provide detailed evidence for how Christian institutions served both to integrate Jutish communities into broader Anglo-Saxon culture and to preserve distinctive aspects of early Germanic Christian traditions. The cathedral scriptorium continued producing manuscripts that preserved early Jutish religious texts, legal documents, and historical records alongside standard Anglo-Saxon liturgical and administrative materials. The survival of distinctive Jutish saints' lives, miracle collections, and ecclesiastical histories demonstrates how religious institutions maintained cultural memory while adapting to evolving theological and administrative requirements. Analysis of manuscript illumination from this period reveals artistic traditions that combine Jutish decorative motifs with Anglo-Saxon and continental European stylistic influences, creating hybrid artistic forms that reflected the complex cultural negotiations characteristic of this period. The preservation of early Jutish Christian scholarly works within Canterbury's monastic libraries reflects systematic efforts by ecclesiastical authorities to maintain intellectual traditions that connected contemporary religious practices with the foundational period of English Christianity. The texts preserved from Augustine's original mission and subsequent early Christian development in Kent provided theological and historical authority that enhanced Canterbury's position within Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical hierarchies while preserving distinctive aspects of Jutish Christian identity. The copying and preservation of these materials required substantial investment in scribal resources and manuscript production that demonstrated the continued importance of Jutish Christian traditions for broader English religious development. Archaeological evidence from the 9th through 12th centuries reveals changing patterns in settlement organisation that reflect both the integration of Jutish communities into Anglo-Saxon administrative systems and the persistence of traditional social structures adapted to new political circumstances. Rural settlements in former Jutish territories show modifications in building layouts and defensive arrangements that accommodated Anglo-Saxon administrative requirements while maintaining traditional family-based social organisation. The positioning of residential buildings relative to agricultural areas, craft production zones, and community gathering spaces continue to follow patterns established during the initial settlement period, though these arrangements were modified to serve expanding economic activities and administrative functions. The urban development of Canterbury during this period demonstrates how former royal centres adapted to serve new functions within Anglo-Saxon administrative and ecclesiastical hierarchies. Archaeological excavations reveal substantial building projects that created additional administrative facilities, expanded commercial areas, and improved defensive capabilities while preserving the basic urban organisation established during the early Jutish period. The street layout, property boundaries, and public spaces that had developed during Canterbury's period as an independent royal centre continued to influence urban development throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, creating distinctive urban characteristics that reflected Jutish planning traditions within evolving English urban forms. Material culture analysis from domestic contexts reveals how Jutish families maintained cultural identity through daily practices and household organisation while participating in broader Anglo-Saxon economic and social networks. The domestic assemblages from 9th and 10th century sites contain combinations of traditional Jutish household items with Anglo-Saxon manufactured goods that reflect both cultural persistence and adaptive integration. Cooking vessels, storage containers, and personal items display hybrid characteristics that combine traditional Jutish functional requirements with Anglo-Saxon aesthetic preferences and manufacturing techniques. The spatial organisation of domestic activities within households continued to follow traditional patterns that reflected Germanic family structures and social relationships, though these practices were adapted to accommodate changing economic activities and administrative requirements. The evidence for continuing cultural exchange between former Jutish territories in England and Scandinavian homeland regions demonstrates how ethnic communities maintained connections across political boundaries through commercial relationships, marriage alliances, and religious contacts. Archaeological evidence from trading sites reveals continued importation of Scandinavian goods and raw materials that served both practical needs and cultural identity maintenance for Jutish communities in England. The types of imported objects, including distinctive metalwork, amber jewellery, and specialised craft tools, suggest that these commercial relationships served cultural as well as economic functions by providing access to traditional materials and artistic influences that supported the continuation of ethnic craft traditions. The linguistic evidence for Jutish cultural persistence within Anglo-Saxon England reveals complex patterns of language maintenance and adaptation that reflected broader processes of cultural integration and identity preservation. Placename analysis indicates that distinctive Jutish toponymic elements survived throughout the medieval period in areas of concentrated early settlement, though these names were often modified to conform to Anglo-Saxon linguistic patterns while retaining recognisable Jutish elements. The survival of specialised vocabulary related to legal procedures, craft techniques, and social organisation demonstrates how Jutish communities maintained linguistic distinctiveness in specific cultural domains while adopting Anglo-Saxon language for broader communication and administrative functions. The integration of Jutish military traditions into Anglo-Saxon warfare demonstrates how ethnic communities contributed specialized knowledge and capabilities to broader defensive efforts while maintaining distinctive cultural practices. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and fortification sites reveals continued use of traditional Jutish military equipment and tactical approaches adapted to serve Anglo-Saxon strategic requirements. The distinctive spear types, shield construction techniques, and defensive earthwork designs that had characterized early Jutish military practices evolved during this period to incorporate Anglo-Saxon innovations while maintaining recognizable ethnic characteristics that reflected traditional warrior culture and military organization. The role of Jutish noble families in Anglo-Saxon administrative systems demonstrates how ethnic elites negotiated the transition from independent political authority to subordinate administrative roles while preserving social status and cultural influence. Genealogical analysis of surviving family records reveals marriage patterns and inheritance practices that maintain traditional Jutish kinship structures within Anglo-Saxon political hierarchies. These families served as cultural intermediaries who facilitated the integration of Jutish communities into broader Anglo-Saxon society while preserving traditional social relationships and cultural practices that maintained ethnic identity across multiple generations. The economic specialization that developed in former Jutish territories during this period reflects both the integration of ethnic communities into broader Anglo-Saxon commercial networks and the persistence of traditional craft knowledge and production techniques that served expanding markets. The development of specialized production centers for metalwork, textiles, and ceramic goods demonstrated how Jutish craftsmen adapted traditional techniques to serve new market demands while maintaining the quality standards and artistic preferences that characterized their ancestral craft traditions. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals production techniques and decorative schemes that combined traditional Jutish methods with Anglo-Saxon innovations to create distinctive regional products that served both local cultural needs and broader commercial markets. The transformation of Jutish cultural identity from lived reality to historical memory began during the late Anglo-Saxon period, as chroniclers and scholars attempted to construct coherent narratives explaining the origins and development of England's Germanic kingdoms. The Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed around 731 AD, established the foundational framework for understanding Jutish origins that would influence historical interpretation for centuries. Bede's account, drawing upon oral traditions, documentary sources, and contemporary political knowledge, identified the Jutes as one of three primary Germanic peoples who'd settled in Britain, specifically crediting them with the establishment of Kent and the Isle of Wight. His description of Jutish origins in the country of the Jutes adjacent to the Angles provided later medieval writers with geographical specificity that shaped subsequent historical understanding, though modern archaeological evidence suggests more complex migration patterns than Bede's streamlined narrative indicates. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled during Alfred's reign and continued by successive generations of chroniclers, preserved and expanded upon Bede's account while adding specific chronological details and legendary material that reflected the political concerns of later periods. The Chronicle's entries for the mid-5th century describe Hengist and Horsa's arrival in 449 AD and their subsequent establishment of Jutish authority in Kent, providing narrative coherence that served both historical documentation and political legitimation for later Kentish rulers. These chroniclers drew upon existing oral traditions, genealogical records, and documentary materials to construct accounts that balanced historical accuracy with political utility, creating narratives that explained contemporary political arrangements through reference to ancient tribal origins and heroic foundations. The development of origin myths surrounding Jutish settlement in Britain reflected broader medieval concerns with establishing legitimate genealogical connections between contemporary rulers and ancient Germanic heroes. The legendary accounts of Hengist and Horsa evolved during the 9th and 10th centuries to incorporate elements from continental Germanic heroic poetry, Scandinavian saga traditions, and Christian historical writing, creating composite narratives that served multiple cultural functions. These stories provided not only historical explanations for political origins, but also moral exemplars, entertainment, and cultural identity markers that connected Anglo-Saxon communities with their Germanic ancestral heritage. The archaeological evidence for 5th century Germanic settlement in Kent supports the basic historical framework of these accounts, while revealing greater complexity in the actual migration and settlement processes than the legendary narratives suggest. Medieval chroniclers working during the Norman period and later demonstrated increasing sophistication in their treatment of early English history, though their accounts of Jutish origins often reflected contemporary political concerns rather than historical accuracy. Henry of Huntingdon's History of the English People, completed around 1154, expanded upon earlier accounts by incorporating additional legendary material and attempting to reconcile conflicting traditions about Germanic settlement patterns. His work demonstrates how medieval historians approached early English history as a means of understanding contemporary political relationships and cultural identities, using ancient tribal distinctions to explain regional variations in law, custom, and social organisation that persisted into their own time. The survival of distinctive Kentish legal practices and cultural traditions provided these chroniclers with evidence for ancient tribal origins that supported their historical reconstructions. The preservation of Jutish historical memory through place names represents one of the most enduring legacies of early Germanic settlement in southeastern England. Toponymic analysis reveals numerous locations throughout Kent and the Isle of Wight that preserve linguistic elements consistent with Jutish dialects and settlement patterns, though these names often underwent phonetic modifications that reflected later linguistic developments. The concentration of place names ending in "inga", indicating tribal or family group settlements, appears most densely in areas where archaeological evidence confirms substantial early Germanic occupation, suggesting that Jutish communities imposed their own naming conventions on the British landscape during the initial settlement period. Names such as Eastry, Fingalsham and Sturry preserve Germanic linguistic elements that differ from standard Anglo-Saxon toponymic patterns, indicating the persistence of distinctive Jutish dialectical features that survived political integration into broader Anglo-Saxon administrative systems. The survival of Jutish legal customs within the Kentish legal code provided medieval chroniclers with concrete evidence for ancient tribal distinctiveness that supported their historical narratives about Germanic origins and settlement patterns. The compensation schedules, inheritance practices, and procedural requirements preserved in Kentish law displayed characteristics that differed significantly from standard Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, suggesting the persistence of ancient Germanic customary practices that had developed independently from neighbouring Saxon and Anglian legal systems. Medieval legal scholars recognise these distinctions as evidence for ancient tribal origins, using legal analysis to support historical arguments about ethnic boundaries and cultural development during the early Anglo-Saxon period. The systematic documentation of these legal differences in royal law codes and ecclesiastical records ensured their preservation and provided later historians with detailed evidence for reconstructing early Germanic social organisation and cultural practices. Local traditions preserved within Kentish communities maintained oral historical knowledge that complemented and sometimes contradicted the written accounts produced by medieval chroniclers. These traditions, transmitted through family genealogies, community festivals, and local religious observances, preserve detailed knowledge about specific settlements, family histories, and cultural practices that provided alternative perspectives on early Germanic development. The archaeological investigation of sites mentioned in local traditions has often confirmed the historical accuracy of orally transmitted information, demonstrating the reliability of community memory for preserving specific details about ancient settlement patterns and social organisation. The integration of oral traditions with documentary sources and archaeological evidence provides modern historians with more complete understanding of Jutish cultural development than would be possible through any single type of evidence. The medieval church's role in preserving Jutish historical memory extended beyond simple documentary preservation to encompass the maintenance of cultural traditions and religious practices that connected contemporary communities with their Germanic Christian origins. Canterbury Cathedral's archives preserved extensive collections of early charters, legal documents, and ecclesiastical records that documented the development of Christian institutions within Jutish society, providing detailed evidence for religious transformation and cultural adaptation during the conversion period. The preservation of saints' lives, miracle collections, and liturgical texts associated with early Kentish Christianity maintain cultural memory of the distinctive characteristics of Jutish religious development, emphasising the kingdom's role as the foundation of English Christianity and the centre of ecclesiastical learning and authority. Monastic chroniclers at Canterbury and Rochester developed sophisticated historical narratives that emphasise the continuity between ancient Jutish settlement and contemporary ecclesiastical authority, using historical writing to support claims for religious and political precedence within Anglo-Saxon England. These chroniclers preserve detailed accounts of Augustine's mission, the conversion of Ethelbert, and the subsequent development of Christian institutions that established Canterbury's position as the primary episcopal seat of English Christianity. Their historical works combined documentary evidence with oral traditions and theological interpretation to create comprehensive narratives that explained contemporary ecclesiastical arrangements through reference to ancient Jutish political and religious development, ensuring that Jutish historical memory remained central to English Christian identity. The scholarly debates that emerged during the medieval and early modern periods regarding the extent and significance of Jutish settlement reflected broader intellectual developments in historical methodology and ethnic theory that influenced European scholarly culture. Medieval chroniclers had generally accepted Bede's account of tripartite Germanic settlement without extensive critical analysis, but Renaissance humanist scholars began applying more rigorous analytical methods to early historical sources, questioning traditional narratives and seeking additional evidence to support or refute established historical interpretations. The development of comparative linguistic analysis, archaeological investigation, and documentary criticism during the 16th and 17th centuries provided scholars with new tools for evaluating historical claims about ethnic origins and cultural development, leading to increasingly sophisticated debates about the reliability and interpretation of early medieval sources. The antiquarian movement of the 16th and 17th centuries generated renewed interest in early English history and Germanic origins, leading to systematic efforts to collect, preserve, and analyse historical sources related to Anglo-Saxon settlement and cultural development. Scholars such as William Camden, John Leland, and later antiquarians conducted extensive field research, documentary analysis, and comparative studies that provided new evidence for understanding early Germanic settlement patterns and cultural practices. Their work often focused specifically on Jutish territories in Kent and the Isle of Wight, where the survival of distinctive place names, legal customs, and archaeological remains provided rich material for historical reconstruction and cultural analysis. The systematic documentation of these materials established foundations for modern historical scholarship while preserving important evidence that might otherwise have been lost through neglect or destruction. The relationship between historical Jutes in Britain and the medieval inhabitants of Jutland in Denmark became a subject of increasing scholarly interest as comparative historical methods developed during the early modern period. Medieval chroniclers had generally assumed continuity between ancient Germanic tribes and contemporary Scandinavian populations, but systematic comparative analysis revealed complex patterns of cultural development and political change that challenged simple ethnic continuity models. The archaeological investigation of Danish sites during the 19th and 20th centuries provided evidence for substantial cultural and demographic changes in Jutland during the medieval period, suggesting that the relationship between ancient Jutes and later Danish populations was more complex than earlier historians had recognised. The development of unified Danish royal authority during the 10th and 11th centuries had absorbed traditional Jutish tribal territories into broader Scandinavian administrative systems, creating new political and cultural identities that obscured ancient tribal distinctions. Archaeological evidence from medieval Jutland reveals significant changes in settlement organisation, material culture, and social structure that reflect the integration of formerly independent Jutish communities into Danish royal administrative systems. The construction of ring fortresses during Harald Bluetooth's reign established centralised military control over traditional tribal territories, while the standardisation of military equipment and administrative practices created unified cultural norms that replaced earlier tribal distinctions. The archaeological record from this period shows the gradual disappearance of distinctively Jutish material culture traditions as local communities adapted to serve broader Danish political and economic requirements, though certain craft techniques and artistic motifs persisted in modified forms that maintained connections with ancient cultural traditions. The linguistic evidence for continuity between ancient Jutish dialects and medieval Danish speech patterns provides complex testimony about ethnic and cultural development in Jutland during the medieval period. Comparative linguistic analysis suggests that certain phonetic characteristics and vocabulary items preserved in medieval Danish dialects may reflect ancient Jutish linguistic traditions, though centuries of political integration and cultural contact had substantially modified original tribal speech patterns. The place names preserved throughout Jutland contain elements that appear consistent with reconstructed Proto-Germanic linguistic forms, suggesting some continuity with ancient settlement patterns, though the specific relationship between ancient tribal dialects and medieval regional speech variations remains subject to scholarly debate and ongoing linguistic research. The development of Danish national identity during the medieval period incorporated references to ancient tribal origins that included Jutish historical traditions, though these references were adapted to serve contemporary political and cultural requirements rather than preserve accurate historical memory. The royal genealogies compiled during the 12th and 13th centuries attempted to trace Danish royal authority back to ancient Germanic heroes and tribal leaders, including figures associated with Jutish legendary traditions, though these genealogical constructions reflected medieval political needs rather than historical accuracy. The integration of ancient tribal references into Danish national narratives demonstrates how medieval societies used historical memory to legitimize contemporary political arrangements while adapting ancient cultural traditions to serve new social and political functions. The scholarly investigation of Jutish origins and development during the 18th and 19th centuries benefited from advances in comparative linguistics, archaeological methodology, and historical criticism that provided new tools for analysing early medieval sources and cultural evidence. The development of Germanic philology enabled scholars to trace linguistic relationships between ancient tribal dialects and modern European languages, while archaeological excavation provided material evidence for early settlement patterns and cultural practices that could be compared with documentary sources. These methodological advances led to increasingly sophisticated understanding of Germanic migration patterns and cultural development, though scholarly debates about specific aspects of Jutish origins and settlement continued to reflect the limitations of available evidence and the complexity of early medieval cultural processes. The preservation of Jutish historical memory within English local traditions continued throughout the medieval and early modern periods, maintaining community knowledge about ancient settlement patterns, family genealogies, and cultural practices that complemented the written historical record. The oral traditions preserved in Kentish communities often contain specific details about local history and cultural development that provided alternative perspectives on the processes of Germanic settlement and cultural integration. These traditions, while subject to modification and elaboration over time, frequently preserved accurate information about ancient settlement sites, family relationships, and cultural practices that archaeological investigation has confirmed, demonstrating the reliability of community memory for maintaining historical knowledge across multiple generations. The integration of Jutish historical memory into broader English national narratives during the medieval and early modern periods reflected the political importance of Germanic origins for legitimizing English cultural identity and political authority. The emphasis on Germanic tribal origins in English historical writing served to distinguish English cultural development from Celtic and Romano-British traditions, while establishing connections with continental European political and cultural traditions. The specific role attributed to Jutish settlement in establishing English Christianity and legal traditions provided these historical narratives with religious and institutional legitimacy that supported claims for English political and cultural superiority within European contexts. Though these interpretations often reflected contemporary political concerns rather than accurate historical understanding of early medieval cultural development. The systematic archaeological investigation of Jutish sites began in earnest during the Victorian period, when antiquarian enthusiasm combined with emerging scientific methodologies to produce the first comprehensive studies of early medieval Germanic material culture in Britain. The excavations conducted by Charles Roach Smith at Richborough and other Kentish sites during the 1850s established foundational collections of Jutish artefacts while demonstrating the potential for archaeological evidence to illuminate historical processes that remained obscure in documentary sources. Smith's meticulous cataloguing of grave goods, pottery assemblages, and structural remains provided baseline data that enabled subsequent generations of archaeologists to develop more sophisticated analytical frameworks for understanding Germanic settlement patterns and cultural development. The discovery of the Fingalsham Cemetery in 1928 marked a watershed moment in Jutish archaeological studies, revealing one of the most complete and well-preserved early medieval Germanic burial grounds in northwestern Europe. The excavations conducted by Audrey Meany and Sonia Chadwick Hawkes between 1959 and 1967 uncovered over 240 graves spanning the period from the late 5th through 7th centuries, providing unprecedented insights into Jutish social organisation, craft production, and cultural practices. The exceptional preservation conditions at Fingalsham allowed for detailed analysis of organic materials including textiles, leather, and wood that rarely survive in other archaeological contexts, revealing sophisticated manufacturing techniques and decorative traditions that demonstrated the high level of artistic achievement attained by early Jutish craftsmen. The grave assemblages from Fingalsham reveal complex patterns of social stratification and cultural identity that challenged earlier assumptions about Germanic tribal organisation and settlement processes. The burials contained elaborate combinations of locally manufactured and imported goods that demonstrated extensive trade networks connecting Jutish communities with continental European markets, Scandinavian production centres, and Mediterranean commercial systems. Chemical analysis of glass vessels, amber beads, and metal objects revealed sourcing patterns that indicated systematic long-distance exchange relationships rather than occasional trading contacts, suggesting that Jutish communities participated in sophisticated economic networks that spanned much of early medieval Europe. The application of scientific dating techniques to Jutish archaeological sites during the mid-20th century revolutionized scholarly understanding of Germanic migration chronology and settlement development. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from cemetery and settlement contexts provided precise chronological frameworks that enabled archaeologists to trace the development of Jutish material culture with unprecedented accuracy. The dating evidence from sites such as Eastry, Sarre and Dover demonstrated that substantial Germanic settlement in Kent began during the mid-5th century and continued through organised community establishment rather than gradual cultural diffusion, supporting documentary accounts of coordinated migration while revealing greater complexity in the actual settlement processes than literary sources suggested. Dendrochronological analysis of timber structures from Jutish hall sites provided additional chronological precision while revealing sophisticated construction techniques and architectural traditions that reflected both continental Germanic building practices and local adaptations to British environmental conditions. The timber halls excavated at Cowdrey's Down and Yeavering displayed construction sequences that could be dated to specific years, enabling archaeologists to trace the development of elite residential architecture and social organisation with remarkable precision. The analysis of construction techniques, spatial organisation, and decorative elements revealed architectural traditions that maintained clear connections with Scandinavian building practices while incorporating innovations that reflected adaptation to British political and environmental circumstances. The development of ceramic analysis techniques during the 1960s and 1970s provided archaeologists with powerful tools for tracing cultural connections and population movements across the North Sea. Petrographic analysis of pottery fabrics revealed that early Jutish ceramics in Kent contained mineral inclusions and clay compositions consistent with northern Danish geological sources, providing direct evidence for either vessel importation or the migration of potters who brought traditional raw materials with them. The identification of specific temper materials and manufacturing techniques that appeared in both Danish and Kentish contexts demonstrated technological continuity that supported arguments for substantial population movement rather than simple cultural influence or trade relationships. Technological analysis of metalworking remains from Jutish sites revealed sophisticated production techniques that combined traditional Germanic smithing methods with innovations developed in response to British raw material sources and market demands. X-ray analysis of weapons and jewellery from cemetery contexts demonstrated advanced pattern welding techniques, complex alloy compositions, and decorative inlay methods that required considerable technical expertise and specialised equipment. The consistency of manufacturing standards across multiple sites indicated centralised production systems or standardised training methods that maintained quality control and artistic coherence across geographically dispersed communities. The excavation of workshop areas at Canterbury and other Jutish centres during the 1980s and 1990s provided direct evidence for craft production organisation and technological capabilities that complemented the analysis of finished objects from burial contexts. The workshop remains included furnaces, anvils, crucibles, and waste products that reveal the full range of manufacturing activities conducted within Jutish communities, from basic ironworking to sophisticated jewellery production, requiring advanced technical knowledge and expensive raw materials. The spatial organisation of these workshop areas demonstrated specialised production zones that balanced efficiency requirements with safety considerations while maintaining the secrecy necessary for protecting valuable technical knowledge. Environmental archaeology techniques applied to Jutish settlement sites reveal detailed information about agricultural practices, dietary patterns, and landscape management that provided new perspectives on Germanic adaptation to British environmental conditions. pollen analysis from settlement contexts demonstrated systematic forest clearance and agricultural intensification that supported larger populations than traditional British farming methods could sustain, indicating that Germanic settlers brought advanced agricultural techniques that enhanced land productivity. Faunal analysis revealed dietary patterns that combined traditional Germanic livestock management with exploitation of British wild resources, suggesting adaptive strategies that maximised food security while maintaining cultural dietary preferences. The application of isotope analysis to skeletal remains from Jutish cemeteries during the 1990s and 2000s provided revolutionary insights into population mobility and demographic composition that directly addressed long-standing debates about the scale and nature of Germanic migration. Strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel revealed that many individuals buried in early Kentish cemeteries had spent their childhood years in regions with geological signatures consistent with Scandinavia, providing direct biological evidence for substantial population movement from Denmark to Britain. Oxygen isotope analysis provided additional evidence for individual mobility patterns, revealing complex migration histories that included multi-generational movements and return migrations that maintained connections between British and continental communities. Carbon isotope analysis of skeletal remains revealed dietary patterns that reflected both cultural preferences and environmental adaptations, demonstrating how Germanic settlers maintained traditional dietary practices while adapting to British agricultural systems and available food resources. The isotopic signatures indicated diets that included substantial amounts of marine protein, consistent with coastal settlement patterns and exploitation of British marine resources that supplemented traditional Germanic agricultural products. The comparison of isotopic signatures between different cemetery populations revealed variations in diet and mobility that reflected social stratification and economic specialization within Jutish communities. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Jutish cemetery sites, beginning in the early 2000s, provided unprecedented insights into population genetics and ethnic composition that directly addressed fundamental questions about Germanic migration and settlement processes. Mitochondrial DNA analysis revealed genetic signatures that connected British Germanic populations with Scandinavian and Northern German ancestral groups, supporting archaeological evidence for substantial population movement while revealing greater genetic diversity than simple migration models would predict. Y chromosome analysis provided additional evidence for male-mediated migration patterns that corresponded with archaeological evidence for warrior-led settlement groups, though the genetic data also revealed substantial female migration that indicated family-based community movement rather than purely military conquest. The comparison of ancient DNA signatures with modern population genetics revealed complex patterns of genetic continuity and change that demonstrated the long-term demographic impact of Germanic settlement while revealing subsequent population mixing and cultural integration. The genetic evidence indicated that Germanic settlers contributed substantially to the gene pool of southeastern England, though the specific proportions varied significantly between different regions and social groups. The persistence of Scandinavian genetic markers in modern British populations provided evidence for the lasting demographic impact of early medieval migration, while demonstrating the complex processes of population mixing and cultural integration that characterized post-migration development. Contemporary scholarly debates about Germanic migration have been fundamentally transformed by the accumulation of archaeological and scientific evidence that provides new perspectives on long-standing historical questions about the scale, nature, and consequences of population movements during the early medieval period. The traditional migration model, which emphasized large-scale population replacement and cultural transformation through military conquest, has been challenged by evidence for more complex processes that combined substantial population movement with cultural accommodation, elite replacement, and gradual demographic integration. The archaeological evidence supports significant Germanic settlement while revealing greater continuity with Romano-British populations and cultural traditions than earlier models suggested. The cultural diffusion model, which emphasized the spread of Germanic cultural practices through trade, intermarriage, and elite adoption rather than mass population movement, has been modified by scientific evidence that demonstrates substantial population movement while acknowledging the important role of cultural transmission and adaptation in shaping post-migration development. The combination of archaeological, genetic, and isotopic evidence provides support for models that incorporate both significant population movement and complex processes of cultural integration, accommodation, and innovation that created hybrid societies combining Germanic and British elements in distinctive regional variations. Current archaeological research on Jutish sites continues to reveal new evidence for the complexity and sophistication of early Germanic society in Britain, challenging simplified narratives about barbarian conquest and cultural replacement, while demonstrating the advanced technological capabilities and social organisation that characterise these communities. Recent excavations at Eastry and other Kentish sites have uncovered evidence for planned settlement layouts, sophisticated drainage systems, and organised craft production areas that indicate systematic community development guided by experienced leadership and supported by substantial economic resources. The quality of construction techniques and the scale of building projects demonstrate capabilities that rival contemporary continental European achievements, while maintaining distinctively Germanic cultural characteristics. The investigation of Jutish settlement patterns using modern survey techniques and remote sensing technologies has revealed previously unknown sites and settlement networks that provide new insights into territorial organisation and population distribution during the early medieval period. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometer surveys have identified numerous previously unknown hall sites, cemetery locations, and field systems that demonstrate the density and organisation of Germanic settlement throughout southeastern England. The systematic mapping of these sites reveals planned settlement networks that balanced agricultural productivity, defensive considerations, and administrative efficiency, while maintaining connections with continental European trade routes and political networks. Ongoing research into Jutish material culture continues to reveal new evidence for technological capabilities and artistic achievements that demonstrate the sophisticated cultural development attained by these communities during their period of political independence. Recent analysis of metalworking remains has revealed previously unknown techniques for producing complex alloys, creating intricate decorative inlays, and achieving sophisticated surface treatments that required advanced metallurgical knowledge and specialized equipment. The discovery of previously unknown artifact types and decorative schemes provides evidence for continuing artistic innovation and cultural development that extended well beyond simple preservation of continental traditions. The current state of Jutish studies reflects the successful integration of archaeological, scientific, and documentary evidence that provides comprehensive understanding of Germanic settlement processes and cultural development while acknowledging the limitations of available evidence and the need for continued research. The archaeological record demonstrates conclusively that substantial Germanic settlement occurred in southeastern England during the 5th and 6th centuries, that these settlers maintained clear cultural connections with Scandinavian homelands while adapting to British conditions, and that they developed sophisticated political and economic systems that influenced English development for centuries. The scientific evidence provides direct support for significant population movement, while revealing complex patterns of cultural integration and demographic mixing that created hybrid societies combining Germanic and British elements. The ongoing research questions that continue to drive Jutish studies include detailed investigation of settlement organisation and territorial boundaries, analysis of economic systems and trade relationships, examination of religious transformation and cultural adaptation, and assessment of long-term demographic and cultural impact on English development. The application of new scientific techniques, including advanced DNA analysis, improved dating methods, and sophisticated material analysis, continues to provide new evidence while raising additional questions about the complexity of early medieval cultural processes. The integration of archaeological evidence with environmental data, demographic modelling, and comparative studies of contemporary European developments provides increasingly sophisticated understanding of the broader historical context within which Jutish settlement and cultural development occurred. The legacy of Jutish settlement in Britain extends far beyond the immediate political and cultural achievements of the early kingdoms to encompass fundamental contributions to English legal traditions, administrative practices, artistic development, and cultural identity that influenced the entire trajectory of English historical development. The legal innovations preserved in Kentish law codes provided foundational precedents for Anglo-Saxon legal development, while the administrative systems developed in Canterbury influenced governmental organisation throughout medieval England. The artistic traditions established by Jutish craftsmen contributed essential elements to the development of Anglo-Saxon art and architecture, while the cultural synthesis achieved through Germanic-British integration provided models for subsequent processes of cultural accommodation and political integration. Modern scholarship has definitively established the Jutes as significant participants in the transformation of post-Roman Britain, whose contributions to English political, legal, cultural, and demographic development were far more substantial and enduring than their eventual political absorption might suggest. The archaeological and scientific evidence demonstrates that Jutish communities successfully established sophisticated societies that maintained distinctive cultural identities while adapting to British conditions and contributing essential elements to the complex cultural synthesis that characterised early medieval England. The ongoing research continues to reveal new dimensions of Jutish achievement while providing increasingly detailed understanding of the processes through which Germanic tribal societies transformed themselves and their adopted territories during one of the most significant periods of cultural transformation in European history. The comprehensive investigation of Jutish origins, migration, settlement, and cultural development demonstrates the essential role played by these Germanic communities in the foundation of English civilization, while revealing the complexity and sophistication of early medieval cultural processes that created the foundations for subsequent European development. Their story represents both a distinctive ethnic achievement and a crucial component of the broader historical processes that shaped medieval Europe, providing essential insights into the mechanisms through which cultural transformation, political innovation, and social adaptation combined to create new forms of civilization from the synthesis of diverse cultural traditions.